Hey, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, and thank you for participating in our virtual community meeting to discuss All-American Asphalt. My name is Catherine Higgins, and I'm a Senior Public Affairs Manager here at the South Coast AQMD. Before we begin, allow me to briefly cover some very general instructions for the meeting. First, to ensure that you hear this meeting in the correct language, if everyone could go to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe icon labeled interpretation. From there, you need to select either English or Mandarin, or might say English or Chinese. After you select your language, if you hear both languages at the same time, click the mute original audio button. However, if you hear everything clearly, you're good to go, and there's no need to click that button. Please note that there's also a Mandarin phone line set up for the meeting. It has the same call-in number, but a different meeting ID. The call-in number is 669-900-6833, and the Mandarin meeting ID number is 967-8818-5750. So during the meeting, all participants will be placed on mute by the host. What that means is you will not be able to mute or unmute your lines manually. Also, the meeting is being recorded. So by participating in this Zoom webinar, you unequivocally agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live meeting and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. Also know that due to time limits regarding the number of people that can appear on screen, only agency staff and other presenters on the agenda will be visible on the screen during the meeting. However, members of the public participating in the meeting will not be visible on screen, but your audio and content will be heard and thus recorded if you raise your hand virtually to ask a question or to make a comment. Our staff will announce public comment portions of the meeting, so you'll be notified when that comes up. For participants on Zoom, if you'd like to make public comment, please click on the raise hand button on your Zoom screen. If you're using Zoom on your smartphone, please tap the raise hand button on the bottom of the screen. For those calling in on phone lines, you can press *9 on your keypad to signal that you'd like to make a comment. Your name will be called when it's your turn to comment, and the host will automatically unmute your line. Also, there will be a countdown timer displayed on the screen for each public comment. And note, if you would like to leave the meeting at any time, you can do so by just hanging up or leaving the Zoom meeting. As far as decorum is concerned for the meeting, we ask that you adhere to the public comment time limit and treat others with courtesy and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. And the final announcement is we ask that you please silence your phone or other communication devices such as your cell phone or your desk phone so that there aren't any interruptions during the public comment period. And with that, we thank you for attending. We ask that you be patient this evening. And now kicking off our meeting with the opening welcome is Supervisor Lisa Bartlett.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Bartlett, Orange County Supervisor for the 5th District, and I'm also proud to represent Orange County as a member of the South Coast Air Quality Management District Governing Board. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time this evening to participate in tonight's community meeting on this very important topic. As you all know, there's been a lot of activity since our last meeting as it relates to All-American Asphalt. There have been several air monitoring projects conducted by the South Coast AQMD, the community, academia, as well as the city of Irvine. Tonight, you'll have the opportunity to hear more about these ongoing air monitoring projects and additional efforts from the South Coast AQMD. While South Coast AQMD and others will be providing you with updates on their efforts, our primary goal is to share information and to answer all of your questions. I take your concerns very seriously, and so does the South Coast AQMD. Our team looks forward to hearing from each and every one of you tonight. With that being said, I would like to turn it over to my fellow South Coast AQMD board member, Mayor Pro Tem Carlos Rodriguez. Carlos?
Good evening. Thank you, Supervisor Bartlett. I appreciate your remarks. Again, for those watching this evening, my name is Carlos Rodriguez. I serve as the Mayor Pro Tem of the City of Yorba Linda and have the honor of serving as the Orange County City's representative on the governing board of South Coast AQMD. I want to first thank you all for taking the time from your evening to join us for this important meeting and continued discussions. I share your concerns on this issue and have been following it very closely. Your health and safety is our top priority. I've been reviewing the air sampling information and, like you, look forward to hearing more about the methodologies, purposes, and conclusions drawn thus far from each of the presenters. I know that in addition to air monitoring, South Coast AQMD has also been actively working with the facility on its permits, which we will receive an update on as well. Today's agenda really reflects South Coast AQMD's dedication to this issue and our commitment to working with the city and the community as we continue this investigation. Tonight also reflects our continued commitment to an open, transparent sharing of information, and also to make sure that you have direct access to express your concerns and for us to answer your questions. I have full confidence that South Coast AQMD will do whatever we can within our authority to address your concerns. With that, I'll now turn it over to South Coast AQMD Executive Officer Wayne Nastry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez, and thank you, Supervisor Bartlett, both for your words and for being here today and showing your commitment not only to the city of Irvine, but also to staff and all that's involved here. I also want to acknowledge that we know that Mayor Khan from the city of Irvine is also participating, as are many other of the council members and city officials. As many of you know, at our last December meeting, we made a commitment to follow up with the community, and that's what we're here to do today. South Coast AQMD increased our presence in this community following public odor complaints that resulted in notices of violation being issued to the All-American Asphalt Irvine facility. We recently reached a global settlement with All-American Asphalt, and in that settlement, it resolved the notices of violation at the Irvine facility, as well as 3 other All-American Asphalt facilities. And that information is posted on our website if you're interested in that. And we'll also be taking questions and or comments for any of the non-air monitoring actions that we're discussing today. So today, we're here to focus on the technical piece of our investigations. And in addition, and as you heard, South Coast AQMD, there's 3 other ongoing air monitoring initiatives. So today, representatives from each group will provide information on their monitoring efforts, their methodologies, and purpose. And the public will have an opportunity to provide comments following those presentations. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And acting as our moderator for the air monitoring portion will be Dr. Jason Lowe. He's our Assistant Deputy Executive Officer for Air Monitoring. So Dr. Lowe.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Mr. Nastry. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of moderating a panel of scientists who will present their findings related to the air monitoring efforts that they have conducted near All-American Asphalt and nearby communities. I feel personally connected to the panel and work being presented as it combines air measurements in the communities in the city I live in and involves scientists from the university I graduated from and the Clean Air Agency team I work with to provide additional information for the air quality concerns. With that, we have the 4 scientists providing their presentations one after another, followed by a question and answer session specifically on the air monitoring efforts. They're going to present in chronological order that the measurements were initiated. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Amir Hossein Mousavi from UC Irvine, who is working with Dr. Jun Wu from the School of Public Health and Irvine community members. He will discuss the community VOC sensor monitoring. Dr. Mousavi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason, for the introduction. So, hello, everyone. I am a postdoctoral scholar working in the Jun Wu Research Group as one of the UCI's environmental and occupational health department groups. And I would be happy today to discuss the findings that we are air monitoring have achieved so far. For some reason, the screen is not really showing it for me. I'm not sure why. Yeah, now it's okay. Sorry, it just went for a second. So the whole story began back in November, that we started to communicate with the community of Orchard Hills and Northwood to try to help them monitoring the different complaints that they had in terms of the odor and some VOC high concentrations that they were suspecting that there is happening in the community. So can we go to the next slide? So we started a community air monitoring with a couple of objectives and a simple goal of providing a spatiotemporal supplemental data to optimize the reference measurement strategies. Because of course, the reference measurements will be and are needed to enforce if there is any problem, but then our sensor data with the objective of monitoring the particulate matter and gas phase VOC level pollutants in the neighborhood and surrounding AAA plant. But also we try to identify if there is any hotspots of VOC in the community, as you were hearing the complaints. But also, and more importantly, that's the kind of the novelty or the strength of using low-cost sensor networks, is to basically investigate the temporal and spatial variation of VOC and PM, which is sometimes not really available and feasible by the reference measurements. Next slide. So we started with the map that you can see on the right side. It shows clearly the neighborhood that we are talking about. The yellow circle shows the AAA plant, and then also the red stars, which are 8 of them, shows the location of the sensors that we have used starting of November 1st, and they're actually an ongoing study going on. We tried to distribute the sensors in different locations with different characteristics, some of them really close to the plant, half a mile to 1 mile distance. We call them source and residential sites. Some of them as the background, very further away, a couple miles as the location 5 and 6. And some of them very close to the kind of sensitive communities, which is our school. And actually they are kind of co-located with the sampling units that the South Coast AQMD has started, the sampling, filter sampling, and the reference measurements. So we have focused on the PM 2.5 and total VOC as the criteria pollutants. The instrumentation that we have used are the low-cost portable Atmotube-proof sensors. And also we are going to provide some meteorology-based analysis based on the data that is provided by the South Coast AQMD on a close-by station. Next slide. So let's talk a bit about the background of the instrumentation that we're using. So that's a portable sensor that it measures PM, particulate matter, in 3 different size bin, 2.5, 10, and 1. We have used 2.5 as a matter of this study. The PM sensor of this sensor device have been validated for field and laboratory by AQS spec team by South Coast AQMD. But in terms of TVOC, there's an ongoing calibration and reference validation going on in terms of the company. And I'm sure that there's going to be some future studies to try to validate the TVOC with the reference measurements with the agency. But then as a simple and kind of short description, there are metal oxide type VOC sensors. There's specific sensor that's being used and calibrated in terms of factory. We haven't used any in-site calibration because of course, lack of resources, but we have reduced the intra-sensor variability by running all the 8 of the sensors at the same time before starting the sampling on November 1st. There are some limitations to the data. Of course, there's no validation compared to the agency data, but of course the strength would be comparing the sensor data to itself in the community to find if there is any problems, or maybe there is any peaks or elevation to the routine concentrations. Next slide. So a little sample data of how the sensor records the data. It's a 1 minute based data, but we have used the raw data is based on 1 minute, but what we have averaged the data in the hourly variation. So here you see the minute-based data in 2 different locations. And as you can see, the VOC level could be different in 2 of the locations that are really close to each other. We do see some variations between weekend and weekday. These sensors were in the field during the wildfire in the OC area, and we did see some peak areas. So we are kind of confident about the fact that these sensors are capturing the short-term and long-term variations in the VOC levels. Next slide. However, in terms of PM 2.5, and as we expect that PM is a regional pollutant, we didn't see that much of a variation, at least between those 2 sensors in the typical 1 week time frame, and the values were really close to each other. However, it still reflects the change in variation within the community in terms of weekday, temporal, and spatial. Next slide. Let's talk about what our data find out. So after almost 2.5 months and 3 months of sampling from November 1st, we do have data from all the 6 sensors that we had initially. So then sensor number 7 and 8, they have been started sampling from January 2021. So that they're not included in here, but these are the data that is being included from November 1st all the way to the early January. So as you can see, these are diurnal variations of hourly averaged VOC levels in the community in different locations presented by different colors. And as you can see, the 2 red and purple colors, which are the closest to the AAA plant, we do see a peak around 10 a.m., 8 to 10 a.m. And then this peak kind of damps down when we go to 2 of the locations that are close to the schools. And then it also kind of dissolves when it goes to the background area in the 5 and 6. It could suggest a potential source of elevation in the VOC, which is also kind of empowered by the changes in the meteorology and atmospheric conditions. Next slide. But also when we are looking at the daily TVOC, which is daily total volatile organic carbon on sensor-based levels, comparing them together, we do see that on a relatively long-term sampling times, as you can see, the numbers above each of the site numbers show the number of the sampling days of each of the locations. So roughly in 80 to 100 days of sampling, we do have variety of concentrations. And as we kind of get far away from the source, which is number 6, and the closest site to the power plant, the AAA would be the 1. As you can see, we do have the reduction in the reduction in the VOC concentrations, the number of the days that has some certain concentrations, and then we do this daily variation could also suggest the potential existence of a source that is causing this heterogeneous variation in the community. Next slide. I want to wrap up my presentation with a couple of slides about the variation of VOC in terms of daily concentrations. So I've tried to highlight in gray in the date column the days that the South Coast AQMD have done the sampling unit, and also try to present the categories of different concentrations of VOC based on sensor data in the right side in different locations. As you can see, the location 2 and location 4 are those that are closest to the sampling units that South Coast AQMD has been implanted. And unfortunately, in none of these 3 days, we did have a high concentrations that could have been captured by the sampling units of South Coast AQMD. So we hope that in the future, the samplings that are being conducted, we could potentially capture these And this is normal because because of the fact that the variation is really high within temporal and diurnal variation, it would be really hard to capture one of these episodes so that we could judge on based on the compounds that are responsible for the elevation. Next slide. Essentially, I've tried to use the very recent data, which is the end of the day is like February 26th, a week ago. And an example of the periods of time that we could potentially represent at a normal and kind of a VOC episode in the community. So the green box kind of shows the very normal days in different locations, then kind of the baseline concentrations in the community. But then in the yellow box, as it's like almost a week, we do see high elevations, relatively high elevations in multiple locations that could be potentially responsible for a unique source in the community that is causing such elevation. Next slide. With all that being said, I guess the group that I'm representing, we believe that we still need some further data to completely understand the whole situation that is going on in the community. One of the immediate actions that could be taken is to co-locate our sensors with one of the source code QMD sampling units to try to kind of validate our data and try to capture the peaks that we see in the sensor data with the sampling units and kind of overlay these data to each other and provide some more and understandable information. And then also with the help of source code QMD, we could try to plot the pollution roses, which would tell us the relation between the concentration of VOC in the community and the wind direction and wind speed, which are one of the most important factors when it comes to the elevation and the concentrations. With that, I will finish my presentation, and I hope that we could further take some steps further to resolve these concerns within the community.
Great, thank you, Dr. Musavi. Next, we will hear about the City of Irvine efforts to conduct air sampling analysis for a variety of chemical species. Speaking to this is Mr. Greg Wolf from York Engineering.
Well, thanks, Jason. Good evening, everybody. My name is Greg Wolf, and I'll be presenting the City of Irvine's air sampling program efforts to date. The city, when they started to look at conducting an air monitoring program, they were very interested in seeing what the facility, the American Asphalt facility, was contributing to air quality. They wanted to have a campaign that was pretty expansive, being able to look at what types of compounds would be near the fence line of the facility as well as in the community. They were also responding to many of the complaints for odors that was being presented to both the city as well as the AQMD through odor nuisance complaints. So with that, we developed an air sampling program starting with some purpose and objectives. So next slide, please. So to begin with, we wanted to do something that would characterize the pollutants near the property as well as in the community. And to do that, we wanted to make sure that we captured a pretty broad range of pollutants that we felt would be important in that characterization. The objective of that would be to develop some kind of a chemical speciation or profile that we'd then be able to use to determine if there were any bad actors or chemicals that were potentially contributing to either health impacts or odor nuisance. Those would become more apparent because of the individual chemical data that we would be receiving from these lab analyses. So how do we find out about what chemicals and pollutants to test for? Well, this facility, as many of you may know, has to report annually to the South Coast Air Quality Management District under an emissions reporting program. They report under a facility ID number, and every year they log these. This is public information. So we reviewed those reports to see what chemical compounds they were reporting. In addition to that, we do a lot of work with asphalt plants. We know what kinds of operations those are, what the equipment is. And so we also thought about what we would want to characterize or include in our sample group. Also just to be able to, based on what asphalt operations were like. And then came one of the objectives that was kind of central to the whole program, which was that we wanted to be able to distinguish fence line sampling data from the community, because the way in which air quality works is that with distance comes dilution through air movement, and that increases or decreases concentration. So we wanted to get some kind of an idea if there was going to be a difference or distinguish any differences between close to the facility and further away. We also wanted to get those that data in a way that could be compared with other data that might be available for what could be considered to be regional or background levels for these same chemical pollutants. And then the last objective was something that came really up front early on, which was the odor complaints. They were the source, as the executive officer mentioned earlier on, of the notices of violation that the facility received. So odor became something that we wanted to test for independently for the purpose of determining what potential odor nuisance may be present there as well. And again, that would be fence line and further out from the facility. So to make these objectives real, we had some criteria that we developed. We wanted to conduct the sampling with test methods that were based on the agencies that develops these methods. The South Coast Air Quality Management District has its own test methods that we followed for some pollutants, as well as US EPA's methods. And then importantly, we wanted to have those analytical results be presented to us in a manner that could be compared on somewhat of an apples to apples or units to units basis with data being collected by South Coast AQMD, as well as comparison with other health-based. Next slide, please. Based on those objectives and the criteria, we developed a framework that became pretty comprehensive. They went through a list of what we thought to be important chemical speciation to identify what compounds, what pollutants were near and away from the facility. So those included semi-volatile organic compounds. Those would be ones with carbon compounds, sulfurous compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So that those kinds of compounds, aromatic hydrocarbons, are something of a pollutant that often comes from heavier asphalt or heavier petroleum type products. Same thing with sulfur compounds. You may know about sulfur compounds from the La Brea tar pits or any other kind of where you have a heavy oil sulfur compounds are present. Ambient metals. We wanted to look at what kind of metal emissions might be happening or concentrations of those. And then odor. Odor does have a certain panel associated. You can send those into a lab. There's people that actually have calibration of their olfactometry to be able to detect odor at a certain recognition level. So we collected samples for that. And then lastly, we also heard from the community concerns about emissions from formaldehyde and other aldehydes. And there is a specific method that is used for testing for those compounds. So we included that in our sample suite of analyses. All of these analyses are conducted by an analytical laboratory. So you can see the analytical test method in the next column there and the number of analytes that it tests for. So in total, we tested for nearly 150 plus compounds. So quite a few compounds. And then for the different purposes of the analysis, that's what we used for the results to compare. So next slide, please. Our sampling program took place at 4 locations over 4 separate days. The first sample location was just outside of the All-American Asphalt facility. If you notice on the map, it's the pin drop furthest to the right. That's just at the entrance road, but it's outside of the facility boundary. And that was conducted on November 19th. Our second sample event was just inside of the facility, and that's the pin drop just to the west of that outside location. And that was sampled on November 30th. Then those two sample events reflected close into the facility, what we would consider to be fence line or property boundary type of measurements. And then we did two more sampling events that were further out away from the facility towards the community. It's not apparent necessarily from this photo, but there's a drainage that basically goes right there east-west from the facility down toward that Rattlesnake Reservoir, as you can see in the picture. So that is a downslope drainage. So we positioned our monitors that were in the surrounding area as close to that as we could. So right off of the reservoir, you see Rattlesnake Reservoir pin drop. That was actually our fourth location. Our third location was the one that's furthest to the west, which is at a fire station location. That's right off of Portola. And then the Irvine Ranch Rattlesnake Reservoir sampling was the fourth event. So at each of those locations, we collected the compilation of those, the framework of sample test methods that were shown in the previous. And then the last slide, please. And then, so in summary, what we did is, so with all these chemicals, we look through them for consistency or any kinds of differences between the fence line group, those two locations, and the surrounding neighboring area. And in those samples, there was generally very consistent between those two. In other words, we didn't have a lot of variation in terms of the compounds that were detected. There were a few instances where the community samples did show higher results than in the fence line samples. And those were typically in the organics, so the ethanol, benzene, and isopropyl alcohol. And then there was a case in which the fence line monitoring showed higher results than the community for particulates. But those were really the only two real observable things in the data that stood out as being things that look different in the data between the two sets. In general, the chemical compounds, the levels that we saw, which were all in the parts per billion level, were found to be generally consistent with the regional concentrations. And that's based on the MATES 4 study. I understand there's a new updated MATES study, MATES, that you can correct the acronym, but it's basically an air toxic sampling program where they go and develop a toxics profile for the whole region. And so what we did is we just looked at our chemical data compared to that chemical data and determined whether or not it was, how to compare to the general region. It looked, again, fairly consistent. We did have one case in which we had a measurement above one of the health risk-based standards. Again, that being a criteria we wanted to be able to evaluate. That was for benzene. That's an organic compound. And that was measured slightly above the 8-hour and chronic REL, or reference exposure level. Odor detection was very low. Usually almost any air sample you collect and send to an odor lab, an odor panel will come back with some detection, because generally just air does have some odor to it. But all of the samples that we collected were less than 100. And usually that is just considered to be a background level of odor. So there were no odors distinguishable or characterizable by the panel, the samples that we collected. And lastly, all of the sampling that we've conducted and all the lab reports are available for the public on the city's website. at the link below. And with that, that concludes our formal presentation.
Great, thank you, Mr. Wolf. And just to clarify, the multiple air toxic exposure study is a study that is run by South Coast AQMD, where we do collect measurements across the South Coast air quality basin at 10 air monitoring sites. So the comparison that Mr. Wolf is making is comparing those concentrations to those that we see in what we considered background air in the South Coast basin. So thank you for that. Next, we will hear from Dr. Barbara Barletta from UC Irvine and the world-renowned Professor Don Blake Lab at UCI, who have provided assistance on the analysis of grab samples in the community. With that, Dr. Barletta.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. So I will be representing our group at UCI, Donald Blake group, where we focus on measuring volatile organic compounds in the air. And in this case, I will be presenting the results from some samples that we collected around the areas surrounding the All-American Asphalt facility. Next, please. So I started with a brief description of how we collect samples and how we measure our, how our samples are measured. So we collect samples using 2 liters electropolished stainless steel canisters that are equipped with a valve. So basically we evacuate them in the lab and then we bring them on the site. And by opening the valve slowly, we can basically transfer the air inside the cans. And so the collection is very, very easy, very straightforward. And then next slide, please. Then once the cans are collected, we bring them to our lab at UCI and we run them through an analytical system. We use a multi-column detector gas chromatographic system. So we have multiple detectors with the idea of measuring a wide variety of volatile organic compounds. I think the most important part here is that our system is quite sophisticated and pretty complex. So it's a type of measurements that can be done only inside the lab, is not portable. We have a great detection limit. We can measure hydrocarbons as low as 3 parts per trillion. And we also have an accuracy and precision in our measurement for the hydrocarbons that is between 2 and 5%. We have a higher accuracy, a higher precision for acetone of about 30%. And we, throughout my presentation, there will be a couple of references to papers if someone wants to go deeper in any aspect of what I'm presenting. So for example, if you want to have more information on our system, here is the reference I'm indicating in this slide. Next one, please. So we can measure, as I said, a wide variety of VOCs. And here is the list of 93 species that we measured in our samples. We measure mostly light, volatile organic compounds. So our heaviest is a C, we go up to C10, so 10 carbon molecules. And so we realized that many of the compounds that could be associated with emissions from an asphalt facility, we cannot measure them because they are too heavy for us, for our system. So for example, we don't measure polycyclic aromatics. But in our suite of compounds, we can have a few ones that could be useful in kind of monitoring these type of situations. And I'm referring specifically to the aromatic compounds. So we can measure benzene, toluene, xylenes, and ethylbenzene. Next slide, please. So what we did so far, we gave 8 canisters to residents around the neighborhood. And 8 canisters is actually a very, very low number to actually have a detailed picture of what the atmosphere, what the troposphere looks like. And the reason is that, so we are involved in this project on a voluntary base. And so we couldn't commit for financial reason to a higher involvement. And so as of now, we only we only gave the availability for 8 cans. 4 of them have been collected and analyzed, and I will be presenting the results. 3 of them have just been collected in the last couple of days, and we still need to analyze. And then we have 1 more that is available to be collected. Of the 4 samples that have been collected and analyzed, the first and second one were collected in December. The first one is referred as event 1 and was labeled as a chemical odor. So the resident took that sample because he smelled something that he qualified as a chemical odor. The second sample is a baseline. I actually asked them to take a sample that they would consider representative of a normal day with no problems, no odors. And so that is what will be indicated in my presentation as baseline. And then 2 more samples were collected, one in January, and both of them actually in January. One was considered an asphalt odor event, and the last one was a can collected when the Atmotube reading number was up to about 5 parts per million. Next one, please. So here I'm presenting data for, on the left side for the alkenes, C6. So starting, those are alkenes that have 6 number of carbons. And then on the right side, you have alkenes. In particular, I'm presenting ethene and propane, which are usually actually associated with combustion. But you can see that the baseline sample, which is represented by the green bar, is in fact overall pretty clean, is most of the time the cleanest sample, even though I can, as you can see, the third event, which was, that was a can that was collected when the total VOC was up to 5 ppm, but they actually did not smell any particular odor. That is sometimes as high as the baseline or even cleaner. But as you can see from the blue bar, which is the event number 1, which was labeled as a chemical event, chemical odor, that is usually pretty high compared to the other cans, and in particular compared to the baseline. Next one, please. So as I said at the beginning, probably the most important VOCs that we measure for this type of survey are the aromatic VOC. And you can see here, I'm presenting benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and hexanenes. So for all of those aromatic compounds, the first event, the chemical odor, was considerably higher. I actually had to cut the scale for the meta and paraxylene, so that you could see well all the other levels. But if you go to the next one, next slide, please. Now on the right, you can see the meta and paraxylene results with the appropriate scale. And so you can see that for the very first can, the one that was associated with the chemical odor, that can went up to 3 parts per billion, while the other 3 cans were about anywhere about from 0.1 to 0.2 parts per billion. Next slide, please. Now this is the result for acetone, which is the only oxygenated volatile organic compounds that we are reporting. And again, as you can see, the very first event had very, very high levels of acetone. Next slide, please. And it went up to 210-ish parts per billion, while all the other compounds all the other canisters, sorry, that you can see on the right side, they are about anywhere between 1 and 2 parts per billion. Next slide, please. So here, the next 2 we can go on briefly. I just want to present a chromatogram to show you in blue that very high can. You can see the acetone peak that has been labeled, and in black, which is at the very bottom, that is the baseline sample. Next slide, please. This is I just zoomed in to really show how enhanced was that very first can. Next slide, please. So I understand that it's very, to give all of this number can be kind of difficult to understand, okay, what do they mean? Like, how representative of, let's say, of an urban center your numbers are. So this is a paper that I pulled from literature, is a study that our group was involved with, and this is a paper from our group. Next slide, please. And I just want to put kind of focus the attention on the aromatic compounds. Next slide, please. It's not coming up. Can you try going to the next slide, please? Okay, thank you so much. So here I want to point the attention to the aromatic compounds. So as you can see, I have this table where I have the event one, which was the chemical odor, event 2, which was the asphalt odor, event 3 was the high levels of VOCs, and the no event is the baseline. And I'm comparing it with the cleanest city and the dirtiest city that I pulled from this paper, where we surveyed 28 different urban centers in the United States. So as you can see, I go back to the xylenes, which were the ones that showed very, very high level in the first scans. And so in event 1, we have a value of about 3 parts per billion. I want to point out that this table is expressed in parts per trillion, and I apologize for the confusion of the units, but because the paper has been published in parts per trillions, I just want to be consistent. So our 3 ppb in my plots here translates in 3000 ppt for the xylenes. So definitely those are levels that are very, very high compared to, generally speaking, urban centers. But we only saw that in the very first scans. The other 3 scans, as you can see, of course, in particular, the baseline, are very clean and are actually what we consider the baseline is higher than the cleanest city in the US, which that year was Phoenix, with the levels that are even a little higher than that. Next slide, please. So to conclude, my point is, for us, for the type of study that we usually carry out, having data for only 3 cans plus 1 background is very limited. So it's I was going to say very hard, but I'm going to say impossible to give any type of hard conclusion because of the limited amount of data. So I definitely, my conclusion, very first to say that we need more samples if we really want to have a complete characterization of the air surrounding the All American Asphalt facility. And of course, we want to have both. We want to have event episodes and non-event episodes to see what we are comparing the event episodes to. So preliminary result, looking at the 3 samples that were collected during episodes, we have 2 of them that were pretty much what I would consider normal air in an urban center, but 1 of the 3 was definitely enhanced for some of the hydrocarbons. And I want to point out that all of our data are available at our website, and I reported there the link in case you want to see with more detail all of the 93 species that we have measured. And with this, I conclude my presentation.
Great, thank you, Dr. Barletta. We will now hear from Dr. Aaron Katzenstein, who leads the state-of-the-art and internationally recognized air regulatory laboratory at South Coast AQMD. He is also a graduate from the UC Irvine group of Don Blake, who you just heard from with Barbara, and will present the findings of the sampling initiative conducted by South Coast AQMD. With that, Aaron.
Hi, good evening. Aaron Katzenstein. I'm the laboratory manager at South Coast AQMD. And I'll wait for the slides there. Thanks, Paul. Next slide. So based on community's concern and our concern also for potential air toxics exposure, in early December, we set up 2 monitoring stations at Northwood High School and Canyon View Elementary. Later in January, we added a 3rd station over at Eastwood Elementary. We're committed to taking at least 10 valid samples at each location. We'll stay longer if the data or other situations arise that we need to stay longer. With these samples we're collecting, as Amir referred to, these are what we call reference samples. They're 24-hour canister samples. And overall, this entire area, as Amir alluded to, is covered by meteorology from our monitoring station, which is just down Irvine Boulevard, just east of the 133 freeway. Next slide, please. So the advantage of taking samples in this manner, one, we get chemical speciation that can tell us a lot of the potential sources in the area. As we've referenced before, this is a very established method that not only we do this, other air agencies and other research groups do this also. And when we get concentrations of air toxics, we can then compare them to health-based reference exposure levels once we analyze the samples. And so from these levels, we can identify if there's any air toxic risk exposure to the community members. Some of the limitations to this method, it's very time consuming. So a 24-hour sample is of course not going to produce real-time data. There's also analytical time and prep time to collecting and conducting the analysis. The other disadvantage is when you collect a 24-hour sample, the short-term odor events often do not show up in the samples unless you have a very high level or a persistent source. Next slide. So this is a picture of our sampling apparatus. On the very bottom there, you see a 6-liter, what's called a SUMA canister. And this canister has been cleaned in the laboratory. It's been filled with ultra pure nitrogen, analyzed, and then evacuated. It goes out to the field with the chain of custody. It goes back with the chain of custody. So we know who's handled the sample. And essentially this setup, we have the canister there, and then just right above it is a timer. The timer at midnight of the sampling day will open up the canister, and the flow is going to go through that critical orifice, which is just above the timer. And that critical orifice limits the flow into the canister, so we get an integrated sample over 24 hours. Next slide. When the sample comes back to the laboratory, we're following EPA method TO15, much like Greg had alluded to also. And these samples get run on a gas chromatograph mass spec analysis. And essentially, there's several benefits to do it this way. With the mass spec, we can identify unknown compounds in the sample. And this is also an analytical method that's used in the National Ambient Air Toxics Trends EPA program, member of the NATS program. We measure samples at Rubidoux and Sela throughout the year. We also use this methodology in our MATE study, as Jason referenced earlier and Greg also referenced earlier. So when we do this analytical method, we have very strict QA/QC requirements. We have a technical advisory document that we have to follow from EPA. We get audited by EPA. We have quality management plans, SOPs, operating procedures. We have to use very strict standards that are certified, and then also go through 3 levels of review for the data before it's finally finalized. This method, as we'll see here, analyzes for over 60 analytes. And once again, it's often used in forensics because you can identify unknown compounds with the mass spec. Next slide, please. So this is a list of the analytes that we look for. There's a good list of hydrocarbons, aromatics like the BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylenes. There's some fumigants in here, some pesticides, combustion products, solvents, and even some refrigerants. Next slide. So when the results come out, we are posting them on our website. There's a link down below. And so far, since our sampling started in early December, we have not seen any elevated values. We did see a little bit of methylene chloride and styrene at the Canyon View Elementary School sample on December 23rd. And methylene chloride and styrene, methylene chloride is used as a paint stripper. So it's likely there might have been a local source at the school site. Next slide. And we also are providing online plots of the data. So we have over 60 compounds, but as Barbara alluded to, we're interested in the aromatics here. So we're plotting benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. Those are toxic contaminants. They're also potentially sources from an asphalt facility. And then if we see any other high levels in our samples, we're going to put those on the plots too. So we have methylene chloride on this plot, as we'll show here in a second. And we're also comparing our levels measured in Irvine with the health-based standards, as you see in the red line, and also our MATES study. So if we go to the next slide, and Paul, there's a play button there. This is a video. So the plot we have on the website is interactive. There's a drop-down menu where you can choose your compound. And the red line is the health-based exposure level. And as you can see that a lot of the results don't show up on the plot. So if you click on that legend there, it will remove the health-based standard and then rescale the plot to show the levels. The hashtag, the hashed out kind of gray area is our MATES 5 data. And this was completed in 2019. We're just finishing the reports right now, but essentially the typical background levels refers to what we've measured at our 10 monitoring stations in the South Coast Basin during the MATES 5 study, and it shows the spread of the values that we see in that study. So essentially the lowest 10% and the highest 10% of the values in that study are not shown there. That shows the 10 to 90% of the values in the MATES 5 study. Next slide. So our next steps at each of the sites, we're close to having 10 valid samples. We're continuing to look at the data from ourselves and also from the other researchers in the area. And we're looking at reevaluating our sampling strategy. It looks like we're probably going to move one of our monitoring locations over to Orchard Hills. And as Amir mentioned, probably co-locate with one of the VOC sensors. Also, later this month, there'll be a facility source test at All American Asphalt. So we're going to have members of our source test group present there. And if needed from this study, we're going to have a better source characterization after that source test is completed. And that's it.
Great, thank you, Aaron. And thank you for all the presentations. And I hope that the information has helped you and the community to gain a better understanding of the type of air data available and their purposes. From my perspective, each group, through different methods, have provided information to different specific questions for the air quality in Irvine. But when looked as a whole and in combination, have really provided a good picture of air pollutants in the Irvine communities. For example, community VOC sensor data, although not comparable to accepted thresholds, provide really important data when and where levels were higher. Also, Dr. Barletta has provided additional chemical data and the levels of chemicals in some of those short-term events and can be looked at from the short-term health benchmarks. The city provided a shorter survey study, but a comprehensively larger list of compounds evaluated for, signaling some compounds to keep track of. All of that has already assisted the South Coast A community next steps, which may include using the VOC sensor data and citing our samplers, as Aaron had mentioned, in our continued evaluation for gaseous air toxics, which are using methods comparable for health thresholds, but cannot capture the short-term events, but currently show that the typical levels and they are below health thresholds. The VOC sensors can be next to our samplers to combine the advantages of both, and that's what we're working with the UCI group with Amir and Junwoo. So as you can see, we're not done yet and are moving forward with some collaborations as there's still a few unanswered questions. Speaking of questions, now is the time for the Q&A session for the air monitoring panel. These questions will be limited to the air monitoring efforts or topic. I ask that you save your questions not related to air monitoring efforts for the general public comment session later in the program. And with that, I will look for the first hand up. There is a raise button feature on their Zoom handle. You hit that raise hand feature and we can, I will go ahead and call the first commenter for questions. So the first I'll call is Jim Conti, or it could be Kim Conti. Go ahead.
They have to unmute themselves.
Go ahead and unmute either Jim or Kim.
Unmute. I did unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is for Greg from York and Aaron at AQMB. In your very limited 1 hour and 1 day samplings, did you notify AAA that there was going to be monitoring going on during those periods?
I guess, Jason, I could start with that. We've done more than 1 day. We're close to 10 days at Northwood High School. And the overall answer to notifying All American Asphalt is no. We have no communication with them on our sampling schedule.
Okay, my question was for Greg also.
Right, and for our part, so we did have to gain access to their facility for the interior sampling. So they were clearly aware of our presence there. They were also aware of that sampling event that happened on their fence line on the outside of their facility. But other than that, the 2 community samples, they did not have any awareness and were not notified.
Great, thank you. Our next comment or question is coming from Jillian Dale, and after that, I'll call on Shauna nothing. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names, but Jillian, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Jillian Dale. Jillian, can you unmute yourself and would you like to make your comment or question? Okay, Jillian, we'll come back to you. Shauna, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your comment or question.
Jason, why don't you let them know how to unmute themselves?
There, oh, she just, or Shauna just unmuted. Go ahead, Shauna.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sure. So the pictures that were shown there on the AQMD slides, the one for Canyon View and Northwood, I think those are backwards. So just want to clarify that if the pictures are backwards, first of all, if the data might be backwards between Canyon View and Northwood. So when you showed the map there, those were backwards. That's the first question I have. Second question regarding that is the midnight to midnight opening. How long is it open for? And if you're doing it at midnight to midnight, does that make sense? Because most of the odors or the odor events have been recognized in the morning. So when I go for a walk in the morning, like Monday morning, just 2 days ago, there was an odor. So when are the odors taken? And if you could stop my timer for the response.
Yeah, on the picture, I received those from our field staff, so they probably got mischaracterized in the email that was sent over. We'll double check that to make sure we get our pictures straight with the locations, but it would not result in any confusion with the data or the samples collected.
Well, the data would be different, maybe, right? So there might have been paint stripping done at Canyon View versus Northwood or vice versa.
Yeah, the samples are they're taken by our field staff, which is completely separate than the people that took the pictures at those locations. Going to your question, so the sample's 24 hours, as we mentioned, that the odor events, if they're very short-lived, they are not going to show up very well in a 24-hour sample. If you have a persistent source or a longer odor event, then you're going to see that in the sample, especially if it has higher levels, kind of what Barbara had shown on that grab sample.
Okay. I guess my other question there is, with any kind of wind or anything like that, it's possible that the sample time could affect what the results are, obviously.
Yeah, certainly. So we do correlate, like on our sample days, we put together what's called a windrows to look at the overall meteorology for when the sample is collected.
Mhm.
And that's where we're working with Amir also to correlate our meteorology with his measurements to see if there's a persistent wind direction corresponding with the higher levels.
Okay. And my next question is for the UCI doctor. So, she mentioned about the alkanones there and the chemicals which are, normal to other parts there. So for AQMD, I think they mentioned about a basin there. So is that normal for the basin of Irvine, Orange County versus LA or the La Brea tar pits or New York or anything?
Sure, I understand your question.
So you mentioned that the alkanones there, the chemicals which are in the normal basin of Irvine. So when you do the sampling, are those types of chemicals normal for a city like Irvine?
As I said, like alkanes and alkenes, they all seemed very, to me, they didn't jump out as unusual for an urban center. That's why, but you're right, every place can be different. And that's why in my conclusion, I highlighted how, if we want to do a study in depth, we would need more samples of what is normal, and then more samples of episodes. But with the exception of like that one can that was a chemical odor, was really elevated for some compounds, but the other ones, to be honest, to me, they look like urban samples.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to, if I could address that a little bit more. So I was a grad student at Roland Blake Lab for many years, and we continue with our measurements at HMD, is that alkanes are present in pretty much every sample. It's just the levels vary across.
Can you stop the timer, please? I have a few more questions. Thank you. About 15 seconds gone by there. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, just to address your question on the alkanes. So they are present, the Roland Blake Lab measures air, across the world. And as I mentioned, they can go down to the subparts per trillion level, and you can see alkanes across the globe. And that just, it's persistent source from fossil fuel usage, and then some are naturally occurring. But across our basin, we see alkanes in varying concentrations, largely due to fossil food use, gasoline vapors and things like that. And also there is some light alkanes associated with natural gas usage also. So that just in general, alkanes are present pretty much everywhere, just at different levels.
Got it. Okay, thank you. My last couple of questions is for Greg Bull, so please mind the timer there. So Greg, I'm just kind of curious, your company, you have experience with different asphalt plants and cement plants and such. So what % of your work has been from those types of plants for your consulting business? Just a first question.
On a percent basis, not very much. We work with a wide range of industry, and we're very familiar with equipment and how it operates. But I couldn't say a percentage that would necessarily be for asphalt plants. But we've done work for asphalt plants.
Okay, so when you say you got the information, of what asphalt plants would or should generally emit, that's where that information is from.
Right. Well, and if you look at the AQMD's public information for the reporting to this facility, that is it's substantially complete list of the chemical compounds that are reported to the agency are the ones that you would see at an asphalt plant.
Got it. Okay. And yeah, I'm just going to mind about 20 seconds more from the time that I have there. So my other couple of questions here is the November 19th, 30th, January 6th and 7th, you mentioned that the community levels were higher than the baseline, and then the baseline was higher than the community. Isn't it that just because there's two different, days, and the wind could be going one direction one day and you decide to come back, 15 days later, it could be going the other direction?
Yeah, they were not timed. They didn't have a similar time stamp on them. So they were intended to be representative of those areas. We had to sample at the locations near the plant when they gave us access. And we wanted to get those sampling done as soon as we could. The sampling that was in the community was done at a different time than the samples around the plant. And wind, of course, if you have wind that just is even a half a mile per hour or a 1 mile per hour, very light wind, that
Right.
still traveling half a mile an hour, right? So it's gonna be temporary in terms of how much it sticks around.
And you alluded to when they gave you access. What does that mean exactly?
Well, they have a facility that is a private area, it's a private property. So we would have to move our vehicle through their plant to get to the location where we were sampling for the inside of the plant sample.
Is there an indication of how much time they got back to you as to when you could come on board from the time you asked for access?
No, I don't think there was really much in the way of a problem on timing. We were really just saying when we would like to sample, and then they said, "Yeah, you're free to come on," and so we did.
Okay, so they need that. Okay. My next two questions was, where was the benzene for the 8-hour measured there? And the last question is, the odor recognition threshold, what days and where was that taken?
So the benzene first. Benzene was at the community's locations. That was actually at both those reservoir and the fire station locations had the higher benzene numbers. So those would have been the 2 January sampling events. And then for the odor recognition, we took odor samples on all of the days, and none of them were very high. They were all, I think the range was like 65 to 85 against really what we would consider to be a background of 100 or less.
So just the layman's terms, like when I smelled asphalt on Monday, is that, forget about the toxicity, does that number that you just mentioned mean that I am smelling asphalt, from an identification perspective? Is that what that means, the odor?
Right, and I can't, say what that would have resulted in if you had been able to collect a sample at that moment and send it to the panel, what your results would have been. But the fact that you were able to recognize it means that it was above the recognition threshold.
Thank you, China, for all the questions. If there is more time, we'll definitely give you more time, but we do have several others who would like to make comments or ask questions. So appreciate your comments, and we'll try to get back to you if there is more time. But for clarification, Paul, can we go ahead and put up Aaron's slides to check the map so everybody here has clarity on the schools and the labeling of the schools, please? And just a refresher, Shannon's question was, and comment was to see if the map, and to me, that's where Canyon View is and where Northwood High School are.
It's the right map.
Can you see? Yeah, can you hear me, sir, still?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so the picture at the top that's pointing toward Northwood High School, that is not Northwood High School. And the middle one there, that may be Northwood High School. It looks like what do you call it? The solar roof thing that might be at Northwood High School. I haven't been up there since my kids graduated, but
that's where the little arrow is. So there's a white arrow pointing to where the solar panels are. So that's where Northwood High School is. So
right. So that little white arrow is for the middle picture then, and the top picture is for Canyon View. So then I think I am correct then.
We'll double check, but I'm pretty sure that that's the map. But okay, we'll double check and we'll move on. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
So our next question, Kevin Leon, you may go ahead and unmute and make your comment or questions. Kevin, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Kevin, we can hear you.
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay. All right, thanks. I couldn't figure that out. Anyways, I just wanted to make a couple of comments and ask a couple of questions. Jason, towards the end there, you mentioned accepted health thresholds. And I believe that when you talk about that, isn't that more of a chronic long-term exposure? And, you know, in the studies that study that AQMD just presented now, it's more of a snapshot. So comparing one-day sample to chronic long-term sample doesn't make real sense to me. And I also want to just make a comment about threshold levels. You know, when you talk about toxins and specifically carcinogens, there's really truly no safe level. You know, a lot of carcinogens actually are not considered, they're considered no threshold, you know, and so these elevated VOCs that are detected on the monitors that Amir presented may represent potential increased risk for adverse events, including cancer. You know, a lot of the carcinogen toxins have no threshold, and there is usually a positive dose response relationship, meaning any amount, no matter how small it is, represents a risk. And this risk increases with increasing exposure. And just the fact that residents have had experiences with odors and chemical odors, as well as asphalt odors, as well as irritations in the nose and throat and eyes. And then you have, you know, these monitors demonstrating elevated VOCs. It all points to the fact that there is something in the air. And I just want to comment that I think what you guys are doing is good, but it needs to be much more comprehensive to determine what the source or sources are and to discover what the specific VOCs are. That way, that's the only way to delineate any potential health risk. And, you know, I know that you guys mentioned the study's limitations, including Barbara saying that there needs to be much more sampling, more than the 2 days that Greg's company did for the ambient air and the 10 days that you guys are doing at the 3 locations. And just for example, Amir pointed out, he had, I guess, put a square around December 2nd and 17th and 23rd, in which you guys didn't find anything in the air. But at the same time, the 2 closest sensors at those 2 locations also didn't detect anything. And so the thought that Amir was talking about collating sensors and your sampling units seems to be a good idea. But I do want to ask a question. Do you guys, after all this review of the data, do you not believe and agree that the study's design lacks sufficient power to extrapolate any of this limited data to chronic exposure and to come to any kind of conclusion regarding health risk assessment? And that question is for both AQMD and Greg.
Okay. So you had a lot of comments and questions there. So I think as far as the first part of the comments, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joe K. Gosh, our Health Effects Officer, to respond from the health effects perspective. Dr. Gosh?
Sure, thank you. Sorry, I was writing down writing down some notes so to make sure I'm trying to address your comments and questions. So so that's that's a really good observation that we have limited amount of sampling at this time, and the chronic health-based threshold or chronic reference exposure level is a long-term threshold. Typically, you're talking about again, kind of much longer term than just a handful of samples here. However, there really isn't, this is really a conservative approach, right? Kind of looking at whatever limited data and, basically extrapolating that potentially to compare it to a long-term threshold. However, in addition to comparing it to that long-term threshold, remember, we also compare it to the MATES data, right? Which is basically how we, our best assessment of what typical levels or background levels of those same pollutants are in our area. And so, what you see with our data is that basically all the samples have pretty much been within the range of typical, right? Our typical Southern California air is not pollution free, right? And that we know. And so and to your point regarding carcinogens, again, our typical Southern California air is not carcinogen free, right? So, but when we compare these samples to your typical levels, you can see that they are within the range. So they are, basically similar to your typical air in our region. So, and then I have your question about, can you use this data to do a health risk assessment? So, of course, we're going to kind of evaluate the data as we have it, but we also recognize that this data isn't necessarily going to represent the long-term profile, and it also doesn't necessarily represent only the facility emissions, of course. And so I'm thinking, I guess when we talk about a health risk assessment, that's something that we do as part of some of our programs, particularly through our AB 2588 program. And that's something where we actually look at long-term data from a facility and do the assessment based on a comprehensive set of data.
Thank you, Dr. Gosh. And just to kind of add into that in terms of the number of samples, this was a sampling initiative to kind of take that survey to kind of see if there were elevated levels of concern. And we have what's called the graded approach, where we're going to look at this initial set of data, evaluate it, and then determine next steps. If we see something of high concern, if there are levels of these gaseous air toxics that we saw that were elevated and of high concern, causing potential health issues there, then we throw more measurements and other types of actions along with it. We have many examples in the past where we've done this, where we looked at our air monitoring data and said, this is really a air toxic concern, and we need to address more, put more resources into it to address that pollution issue. So we do have a history of doing that, but the opposite of that is where if we're seeing data that is not suggestive of these high concerns, then we shift a little bit of the strategies, and we will have to divest some of the resources when appropriate. But in the case for the Irvine Asphalt plant, we are working with the June Woods Group and Amir to look at some of the missing gaps that we are looking at our network and proceeding forward to do some of that co-location of their sensor data and our air sampling that has the regulatory methods that can be compared against the health-based thresholds. So again, combining that power and really filling in some of the unanswered questions. And then I believe the question was also directed at Mr. Wolf. So Mr. Wolf, if you'd like to respond as well.
Sure. I would agree, that usually when we do these types of air monitoring programs, it's investigative, and we are looking for clues, indicators that there could be problems. And that's why the speciation approach was taken, because we wanted to capture as broad a range of compounds as we could in case there was an outlier, something we could point to. But the data taken so far doesn't indicate that we can see a chemical compound that's strongly to be pursued. So I think at this point it's more really just would be more investigation or confirmation of the results. But yeah, right now there isn't any indicators of strongly that we're pointing to a specific chemical to go after.
Great, thank you. With that, we'll move to John Longenecker. John, if you would like to unmute and provide comment and or questions. John Longenecker, would you like to unmute and ask your question or provide comment?
Jason, you need to have them press whatever
Okay, yep, I got a notification. Yeah, there is, just for clarification, there is no unmute button until the host requests us to unmute. So when you call on us, just the host can go to the list of participants and request us to unmute because we don't have it in our UI on the Zoom client.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, appreciate it. I was frantically looking, so for the unmute button, so. But anyways, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for doing these tests and looking into that, and just the previous questions have been, I think, been really good. A lot of them have been on my mind as well. But my question's more around, is there something that the community can be doing that we can, because obviously we have a very big invested interest because we've purchased expensive homes and obviously want our area to be healthy and safe for our families, that we can do to help provide a more granular or perhaps a more frequent type measurements ourselves. Obviously, we're not going to have the sophisticated equipment that you do, but perhaps a more, if a bunch of homes had stuff that we're recording or reporting, if there's anything like that, I think that would be very helpful for the community to be able to engage in this process. I don't know if anyone has any inputs or thoughts on that.
So John, this is Jason. So I think that's a great question. And I think that's why we're working closely with the UCI groups who have been working with the community residents and leaders for that. So we're collecting their input, and we have opportunities like this in a public meeting where if there are some ideas or areas of support that can be provided, they can be discussed and considered. So the public meetings are a good starting ground for that discussion.
Okay, and then as far as like collecting the data, could there be any sort of like partnership where, if we get a bunch of equipment that they could then take a more, like for example, if we have a consumer device that detects VOCs, could that then be used to trigger a sample that might be more kind of a snapshot, a point in time versus a longer 24-hour period that could be a little more diluted? Could there be anything like that?
So those are some ideas, and like I said, if the approach makes sense to address the question, then those are types of things that definitely can be considered. But you've heard from a lot of capable groups here, and we at South Coast are also looking at different options to answer the specific questions, especially with regards to asphalt emissions, but other things as well.
Okay, and then my last point, do typical consumer, devices that are measuring higher VOCs or something like that, would they, obviously that's a very broad range because it could, VOCs come from so many different sources, but do those typically also capture things like benzene or other pollutants that could be of concern? And that's my last question. I hear silence.
Jason.
Right. Can you repeat parts of that question? I was going to actually ask Aaron to answer that question.
Yeah, sure, of course. Just because I do see other people from the community that, are here that they do see measurements of elevated VOCs typically around when they're smelling and odor. Now, obviously, these consumer grade things are going to be really broad range, and they just say VOC, which is really broad. But are those typically going to capture things like benzene, and some of these other pollutants of concern? That's my last question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's been a lot of sensors that have hit the market, in the past year. So at AQMD, we have probably the foremost testing program for sensors in our laboratory. It's called the AQ Spec program. And so far, the sensors we've tested are mainly for particulate matter. We moved into some ozone and NOx sensors, but the next frontier is the VOC sensors. And the VOC sensors are very tricky to test because, are they linear to different types of compounds? If you have benzene perhaps versus formaldehyde, do you get the same response for the same concentration? That's a question we have to figure out still. The same thing as the sensors are metal oxide sensors. So those sensors in relation to say like a PM sensor degrade over time. And so these are a lot of questions that we have to still understand. And this is probably our first introduction to the use of VOC sensors in a community like this. I think that's where this co-location that we're hoping to do here in the near future is going to be very important for us.
Great. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you taking the time. That's all I had.
Great. Thank you, John. Next, we have Leslie Tan. So Leslie Tan, you'll get the unmute notice soon.
Okay, hi, this is Leslie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. So my first question is, out of the, I think I counted all the samples that the AQMD has taken. I think it's a total of 31 samples. And out of the 31, I noticed that 9 were invalidated, which means like 29% of the samples were nullified. So according to your website, it states that your agency may invalidate a sample due to a variety of reasons, which includes equipment malfunction, loss of power, and operational issues due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you actually like share with us why there's such a high percentage of the samples that were invalidated?
Yeah, certainly. Well, early when we started in December, we got the December 2nd sample, then there's a fire that occurred out there. So we did not sample after that for, I think 1 or 2 weeks. I had to look at the timeline there. Then what happened is we had 1 or 2 shutdowns in the laboratory related to COVID. So there's some samples that kind of expired over time. We have very strict standard operating procedures on analyzing these samples. And there's been a few issues with that timer that triggers the sample, basically programming issues that we got the sample back. And if it's not below, if it's at ambient pressure, we feel that the timer either ran too long or the critical orifice was not calibrated. So we had to go back and make sure that that sample is collected over 24 hours during that time period that we expect it to be. And that's been pretty much the biggest problem is those timers and those critical orifices. So what we did back in January is bring them all back in, set them up in the lab again, re-clean them, recalibrate them, so that we made sure they're operating correctly over the 24-hour period, and make sure the canisters, when they come in the laboratory, are just slightly under negative pressure. So we understand that that sample was collected over a 24-hour period.
Okay. And then I also noticed that, like between the samples, it's about 6 days, right? So
that's correct. Yeah, that's, sorry to interrupt, but that's actually, we have a schedule and that correlates with our sampling for our other monitoring stations for VOC samples.
So like with that, do you think that the All American Asphalt could easily figure out when you're going to be sampling? Because it's almost like every 6 days from what I observed.
Well, yeah, there's some that we don't have on consistent 1 and 6, but I don't think they would change their operations based on our sampling. That would be pretty hard to do.
Okay. And then I believe in the last public meeting, you guys mentioned that the crumb rubber, the system at the Asphalt production was offline since November. So how do you think, it has actually impacted the sampling done by York, Nino and Moore and AQMD during this period of time in which, they temporarily stopped using the crumb rubber system?
Sorry, I missed a little bit. My internet connection went out. So the crumb rubber was down. And I think perhaps maybe that'd be best for our compliance department to answer that.
This is Amir Dejbakhsh. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for Engineering and Permitting. So the chrome rubber system was down, and they put the system back in operation in February 18th, basically last month.
Okay, but my question is, do you think, when the system was down, when it was offline, do you think it would impact the sampling that was done or collected by, the consultants or AQMD? Do you understand my question?
So maybe this will help. I mean, I think part of this is that there's going to be a source test conducted on that process, which will give us more information about the emissions of that process. So as part of that process, that crumb rubber will be subject to some measurements and be looking for a whole host of compounds and chemicals to provide us information that, again, in learning more information, we can examine how we are doing our sampling and gather more from that. So we will be awaiting that source test results to help provide that additional information.
But would that system actually create a lot more pollutants?
Yeah, so maybe I can answer the question again. Well, look, you're correct. When the chrome rubber system operates, we expect it to have additional emissions. The reality is, all the samples that were taken, the system was down, so that didn't really affect the information that was being provided or that was being gathered as a result of our sampling. The system has gone back up on February 18, and they've been operating it intermittently since then. And we're going to do a source test at the site. So the facility is required to do a source test within 30 days of their initial operation, which was February 18th. And they're supposed to give us the data, and then we will know better what the emissions will be from the chrome rubber system. And the emissions at the generation source, which will be the equipment, would be the highest. Because by the time it's released into the atmosphere and gets to the monitors, it will get diluted. So we know exactly what is being released as due to the operation of the chrome rubber system.
Okay. So when the chrome rubber system is in operation, do you guys actually have like a counter or something that would track how much it's being produced?
So Leslie, that may be better suited for the general comment section.
Oh,
if you have something related to monitoring with that question, I'm okay
It's
if
a source test.
right.
okay, no problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Dean Baker, you have your hand up, so go ahead and unmute and ask your question or comments.
Okay, good. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Good, thank you. Just a couple of questions. One is, I presume somebody at some point will look at the rank correlation of chemicals across at least the ones that have done the speciation analysis with the GC mass spec. Has anybody looked at that? Because I think that also gets at sort of the source testing that was just discussed in terms of honing in on what are the major chemicals in order to focus. Because I know when there's 60 or there's 90, it seems like there's really a smaller subset that seem to both be higher and maybe might be of concern to people to do that. So is that correlation going to be looked at by anybody, since the data comes from 3 different sources?
So that is something that we will be looking at. As mentioned, we'll be conducting, or a source test will be conducted for that process, and we'll be examining the results of that source test to see if there's things to look for as far as the air monitoring strategy.
Okay, I have a couple of questions that kind of bifurcate the 2 strategies that have been talked about. One is the co-location of the total VOC by sensor data with the 24-hour canister data, which is needed for chronic. So we're talking here really about the chronic REL assessment. Since most of the sampling was done by HMD and all of it by Wolf, prior to co-locating any of the data, and some suggestion from the initial pattern that they were sampled on relatively low days. It's not an issue here of trying to get high days, because now we're talking about chronic, but typical days. So you want your 10 samples to be on typical days. Going forward, will there be enough co-located data to sort of see whether the days that are used for sampling are at least representative for that community? That requires the co-located. And before I run out of time, on the acute or the odor threshold, you keep saying you're exploring options, and I think that that's great. I want to make a specific technical question, which is the 24-hour sample is 24 hours. So the shorter ones, we heard from Wolf about that approach. What the Blake lab has done is they use the canister evacuated over a shorter period of time. But what Barbara was describing in the meeting the other week was that they could set that up in an automatic sampling array so that one canister is evacuated, let's say every 30 minutes or something like that. Does the AQMD have any equivalent kind of sophisticated sampling that could both do the speciation down to parts per trillion, but also get it to a temporal resolution of every let's say 30 minutes or an hour?
So just entering from a larger kind of agency perspective, the measurements are one component, and you're correct. There's kind of a bifurcated effort, one to address kind of this chronic long-term question of impacts to health, and the other is about the short-term nuisance. And as far as when we talk about, and I think we've explained the long-term part, and I'm focusing now on the short-term part. So when looking at the short-term part and where measurements can support an investigation, it's mostly to identify the types of compounds that are present in that short-term event. Very much like you said, in terms of what Dr. Barletta had presented. And in terms of the investigation, and maybe our deputy for compliance can also provide additional information, but when we're dealing with a known source in the area of which, this one specifically was looking for All-American Asphalt in the sampling initiative, the investigation already knows what the source is. So providing information from a measurement scale doesn't add any value for that. And if Terrence, you want to add maybe a few more comments to provide some perspective of the measurements in relation to the short-term nuisance.
Hi, Jason. Am I in?
There you are. Yes.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I mean, I think our point would simply be to add that it's a separate inquiry when we are looking at monitoring versus nuisance. And so oftentimes these concepts get conflated, but really what we are looking at is nuisance is the impacts of odors and similar types of things on someone's enjoyment of their property and that sort of thing. And so it's really a matter of responding to complaints, having our inspectors confirm in person, and upon receiving a sufficient number of complaints and confirming them, being able to issue violations, which then go down a path where our legal department can negotiate potential changes at a facility and that sort of thing. That's separate from monitoring and sampling and attempting to see, what types of emissions, what types of pollutants are potentially at issue. And so they're really separate concerns, and they go down separate pathways. And I think that's, from an enforcement standpoint, our focus.
All right. And Dr. Baker, did you have any other comments or questions?
No, except for the fact that in investigating the source of odors, that we heard that there may be asphalt odors, solvent type odors, or other things, and their patterns did seem to be somewhat different. So I guess I just say, I think that there is a role for environmental monitoring and addressing sources and patterns of exposure. So I was just wondering whether there was the technical capability other than just responding to complaints and issuing a complaint, whether there's actually a technical capability to do that. What I kind of heard is that's not what you do. But my question was, we know from what Dr. Barletta said that it seems like the Blake Lab does have that kind of technical capability. I wondered if AQMD had anything equivalent to that, or whether you're exploring any kind of technical environmental monitoring thing. And I don't mean like turning it on right when there's an odor, but trying to get at more what's going on during some of those diurnal variations, which at least according to the presentation from the sensor was actually consistent enough that it could be looked at through the shorter term canister sampling. So I don't want to get more into the technical things. I just wondered whether you guys had the technical capability of doing that kind of high temporal resolution sampling.
So to answer your question, yes, we do have some of that capability. At this moment, though, as far as addressing some of the questions at hand, at this point, using the graded approach, we don't think at this point applying that technology as for answering those types of questions that we're trying to address are part of that scheme. Okay, if there's no more questions from Dr. Baker, I will move to KMA 99129.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And if you can put your name for the record, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, actually my name is Song and I've lived in Orchard Hills for 5 years. For the past 4 years, I was smelling those asphalt odor, but I didn't realize there was an asphalt factory on it. So I just recently, from last year's, I reported to AQMD that I was smelling those asphalt. So I just want to make some comments. I experience the strong asphalt smells during the summertime more like especially in hot summer days. Better more than the just current like winter time. So
just quick question, sir. Is this related to air monitoring or is this a general comment about the asphalt plant in general? Because we do have a public comment section that is later in the program.
Oh no, this is actually related to air quality because I was just wondering if you are planning on measuring the air quality during this more summertime.
So unless there's activity related to the plant or the source test indicates that there's other things to look at while that process is going, we're going to be following the data. So the answer will be it depends on kind of our continued initiative right now, whether or not that will last, or at least the South Coast AQMD initiative will be continued during that time frame.
Okay. That's about it then.
Great, thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Next, let's hear from Kim Wong. Kim Wong.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, I appreciate the time. Thank you so much for providing visibility and transparency and all the data. I know that it's still kind of early on and you guys are looking for more samples. Based on what you're finding today, and maybe this is a question to Dr. Ghosh to follow up, or I'll open up to the group, but I mean, I don't have a technical background. I don't know all these different acronyms and all these data points. So it's hard for me to follow and understand what you guys are going through. But at a high level, and to dumb it down, like based on what you've seen today, or based on what you've seen up to today, do you feel that are we within like normal thresholds of what you see commonly in SoCal air, or are you guys indicating that there's not an issue at this point because there's not enough sample data?
I guess I can comment on that. So as I said, we only have 3 samples with event data. If all of those 3 samples would have been all equal and let's say with the same level of the 2 out of 3 samples that I saw, I would say, well, this is normal urban air. There is really nothing that jumps up to my attention. As I said, one of those 3 was, however, quite elevated for some VOCs. So on the other hand, if the 3 of them would have been all like that one high sample, I would say, well, it looks like we have a problem. My bottom line is, I don't know, because from our perspective, like the Roland Blake group at UCI, we didn't have enough samples. I would love to see more samples. So as of now, I cannot give an answer. I really don't know what I can say. I mean, I don't know what to say without a higher number of samples.
I also want to say that based on the data Amir presented, that we have some suggestion that there could be some local sources and there could be some impact from the Asphalt company. So we also need more data to see that.
And then Dr. Junwoo, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Junwoo, professor of environmental and occupational health at UCI.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you for those opinions. It sounds like it's inconclusive at this point based on what we're seeing today. Kind of like next steps.
Sorry, if I could just weigh in real quick.
Yeah, sure.
This is Joe Kagosh from South Coast AQMD. So our general assessment, kind of again based on the data we have so far, is that the levels that we are seeing have all been within typical levels, right? And it means by typical levels we mean we do these air monitoring studies in several different locations, typically residential locations, so not necessarily really close to facilities or anything, and the levels that we're seeing have been within that normal range. So.
Okay, thank you for that. And my last question is, what are kind of like the next steps and the goal of all this? I'm fairly new to this initiative. I just saw some news and I started Googling it around. So I know there's a lot more history behind this. But in terms of next steps, like, is there plans? Are we trying to get more sampling to help make this a little bit more conclusive? And what's the end goal? Like, is there a recommendation that comes to this, and where does that go? What's the goal here?
So I think from the agency goal, it's to ensure that the air or the emissions coming from the plant are not affecting the health of the nearby communities. From the air monitoring perspective, it's very helpful to collaborate with the other scientists because their groups are providing valuable data to help with that, addressing that question. And to part of that, to immediate next steps, some of the temporal and spatial data that the community data has provided with the VOC sensors, they can help us cite some of our samplers. And as Dr. Kenstein mentioned, we're looking to move in a little bit closer to where some of the more of the complaints, as well as some of the sensor data, more complaints from our side in terms of smelling the asphalt odors and other things. So we're following that data, and then we're collaborating with with Junwoo and Dr. Musavi to be able to use their data to help cite our samples, and then also co-locate some of their sensor data with ours to get a better understanding of what the sensor data means. And as Aaron mentioned, Dr. Kenstein mentioned too, that we're also using our air quality sensor performance evaluation center to do evaluations on that particular monitor. So those are kind of some of the next steps. And then as mentioned, we have this source test that'll be coming up in a month or two, and we'll be evaluating that data from our sampling perspective. So with that, it's a combination agency effort. There'll be more updates later in the program to show the other efforts that we're doing to achieve that goal.
Well, thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate all your efforts, and this is really good information. So thank you for all that you're doing, and looking forward to future information sessions.
Great, thank you. Dr. Junwoo, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. So the comment is that since we have experienced the multiple complications since November to now, including what you mentioned, the offline of the chrome rubber system over the time, and the impact of the wildfires, and also the holiday season, etc. So I feel that because of all those complications, that definitely have an impact of our sampling schedule and data. So I would strongly suggest that we continue with this sampling effort over time. And then my question is about the future plan. So especially for the WAF, the question is to Greg on whether there's any additional plan for the sample from now till maybe summer or even the entire year. And also for AQMD, I know you're working with us to collect more samples. So I hope that a co-located sensor and your data can provide more calibration of the sensor and more informative information about the species. Thank you.
June, was part of that question to Greg?
Yeah.
Okay, Greg.
So the future sampling plan.
So Greg, would you like to respond to that, please?
Sure, Dr. Wu. So I don't believe the city has anything currently contracted with us to do going forward. Doesn't mean that they won't. It just means that at this time, there isn't anything that we're already on contract to perform.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let's try Jillian Dale. We tried you before, but let's try again. Jillian Dale. Jillian, can you hear us? Can you unmute? Okay, we'll try you again after a few other.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Great. Okay, Jillian, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jillian. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I had some problems with it. So my question goes back to Dr. Musavi, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. But on his, I believe it was slide 8, he showed a graph, and it was showing the different levels, and they were all in like different shades of blue, and some of them were pretty dark and to light. I was just wondering if you could assign, like, I think was like greater than 2 ppm, then 1 to 2 ppm, 0.5 to 1 ppm. Like, at what point does it become dangerous levels? And instead of levels of blue, like our shades of blue, could you assign it in almost like yellow, like green, yellow, red, and like so that we can actually see like at what point it becomes of a high concern?
So Dr. Musavi, Paul, can we go ahead and put up Dr. Musavi's slide number 8, please? And then while you do that, we'll queue up Dr. Musavi to respond.
Which presentation, Jason, is that?
That would be the first presentation, Paul, slide 8.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Give me a sec, please.
Thank you. Dr. Musavi, it's regarding the slide with the colors scale, commenting on.
I think it was slide 8.
I believe that's it, Jason.
Yes, that's
all the variant blues.
So
yeah. So, if you were almost to assign like, green, yellow, red, at which point is it of concern?
So
instead of the shades of blue.
do you can you hear me now?
Yes,
I can, yes.
Sure. So initially, that was the plan for kind of the better understanding of, the variation in the data, kind of trying to show you, the theme color of like RGB or like green and, yellow and red. But then that might cause some misunderstandings with the already established color theme of AQI, which is the air quality index provided by EPA, based on different hazard level of air quality concentrations. So that's why we tried to use another theme, color theme, but then it's really hard to comment on the health hazard of these levels because of a couple reasons. I guess it went over a circle a couple of times in discussion that the sensor data that we have been providing here, it does not really provide any comparison with the reference measurements, and it would be hard to use that as a kind of a reference reading to kind of input that to the health risk assessments. And then second, the levels of the VOC that we see here, these are based on sensor data, and these are total VOCs. And typically, in order to kind of take them accountable as an absolute value in comparison to another, measurement method, like those that are using basically by SARS-CoV-2 QMD, we would need some further validation or potentially calibration collocation. So essentially what we tried to do is to just compare the sensor data within itself, because that's what is actually reliable, because we have kind of collocated these sensors at the same location before starting, which is a kind of a reliable and well-known method when you want to start doing sensor measurements. But then the color theme here actually shows that, you do have some darker colors, more frequent in some of the locations. And actually the color is more lighter in some other locations, like locations 6 and 5, which are obviously the background locations. However, again, I wouldn't really comment on the hazard level of them, but I would compare them as a high, or low within the sensor data. That's a tricky part, and we don't want to confuse, either the research bodies or the community member in terms of giving out, confusing information in terms of health hazards or comparing our data with the reference measurements, because as I mentioned, and again, it went also over the circle, this one as well, that we don't have that much of a concentration-based standard in terms of VOC for outdoor measurements. So to wrap it up, we'd use this theme, the color theme, to try to contrast the concentrations within the sensor variation, but also not to confuse the color theme with the AQI as the agency suggests.
Okay, and then also really quick while I have you, slides, I don't know if it was slide 9 or 10, but you had another graph, and some of the numbers, yeah, they're in the dark blue. They're quite hard to see, but they look like they were, oh, go back to the other one really quick. No. That one. Yeah, I just want to see if I saw that correctly. 27.557 in location 4. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So actually, I could explain like a short version of my explanation so that I could save some time for you. So the thing is that we do see some, like across the board from January 30 to February 26. Those are the 2 days in location 4 in February 21 and 22nd that we did have very high, above any type of thresholds, VOCs. And that was kind of repeating over the day. So these are average based on hourly data. But of course, as important as is that the residents that are living close by location 4 might have been exposed to high VOC levels. That's something that we are kind of confident about. But then the fact that how the sources around the area have been affecting that elevation is a question that need to be answered. So the first approach would be to see if we have seen such elevation in all of the locations or not. So as you can see across the board, location 8, location 6, 5, 7, and 8, which are the closest ones to the source, we don't see that much of an elevation, which, we might as well expect those to have these much of, elevation as a location within the community. So that kind of raises the question that either we do have another source in the community ongoing, and that kind of makes it hard for us to disentangle, the effect of multiple sources in the community. So here is which we need to, which actually is part of the future work of, I guess, the collaborative work of us and South Coast AQMD to try to apply the meteorology conditions, especially wind speed and wind directions data to see if those elevations are associated with the wind direction coming from multiple potential sources in the community.
Okay. Are these going to be available, this presentation, somewhere for us to access?
Well, I believe so. I'm not sure. I mean, right, Jason?
I believe, well, this entire meeting is being video recorded. So there's going to be the presentation, along with Dr. Musavi's presentation of it available for that. And I believe we can provide the presentations, but we'll ask the presenters first, of course, if it can be posted.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next person is labeled Irvine. So would Irvine please unmute when given the cue, and you'll be given your chance to comment or ask questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, my name is Dee Fox, and I just have a question about are we going down the right path here? I mean, it seems like you're limited on your samples. You can't do the short-term odor events. They don't show up in the samples. You only tested 3 samples, and the data presented is limited. That gets said over and over again. And so I just want to know, is the information you're presenting to us, it has a lot of issues about its reliability. And because of these limitations, I mean, how can you even come to a conclusion about any of this? Is this ever going to be fixed? I mean, are you going to be able to test short-term odor events? I guess is my question, number one.
So I think what you've heard today is that there's multiple different methods here. Some of them can and have looked at looking at measurements for the short term, such as the VOC sensor data, as well as the data that was presented by Dr. Barletta. I mean, the main goal here is to not have any nuisances, right? I mean, I think the goal of our agency to work with the facility to have their operations so that there are no nuisances to even report. And that's the end goal. And the measurements are providing information, extra information towards that goal.
Right, but the information you're telling us is you're not finding anything.
So I think for sure in our in the South Coast AQMD measurements, yes, as you've heard Dr. Joe Kigosh and also Dr. Katzenstein, in our data, we're finding what we consider typical levels. And again, we're addressing this question. Right. Dr. Musavi presented on data that fluctuates. There are time periods that are higher than others, but the nature of those compounds is unknown. And then you saw data presented by the city, and for the most part, they are within typical levels, and there's some that we'll keep track of. So again, looking at all this information together provides that picture.
Right. So, okay. So, does AQMD, do they issue violations if you find that they are in violation?
So I believe the short answer would be yes. And if you have other questions of the nature that are not related to monitoring, we do have the public comment section at the end.
Well, it does kind of pertain to AQMD because they won't be there at the public comments, will they? I don't know. I just want to know. I mean, this company has had many violations in the past. Has your company ever given AAA a violation?
So we are providing a compliance update, which includes that type of enforcement action, but that is later in the program. So
the short answer is
but
yes.
I mean,
right. The short answer.
Oh, you have.
Yes.
You have. Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Okay, thank you.
May I comment on something?
Dr. Wu, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think in one of Emir's slides, he just showed there were, the bar, like different shades of blue, and the locations which are closer to the AAA facility did have somewhat more darker blue days than the other locations further away from the facility. So if you can bring that up, then there's some indication of the AAA emissions. So we just need more data.
And that's why we're working together to move some of our samplers to similar locations.
Yeah, slide 8. Yeah, so the location 1 and 3 are closer to the AA facility, and 5 and 6 are the ones further away from the facility. So you can see like darker blue and all these higher concentration days are more in the locations closer to the AA facility.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wu. And did you have any more questions? Okay, not hearing any. We'll move to Lena Chu. Lena Chu, you'll be prompted to unmute.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thanks to all the experts in the room for their efforts, and special thanks to the UCI volunteers that spend their precious time helping the local residents. I understand based on the limited sampling in time and quantity of samples obtained so far and the results generated so far is not conclusive to be able to guarantee that having the asphalt plant so close to the community, as close as 0.5 miles, is safe for the residents. Well, my question is, there are certainly some toxins at the source that are potentially harmful at elevated concentration or even extended exposure over time, even at lower concentration levels. And what can be done to determine a safe perimeter by tracking the toxins from the source and see how far it travels? If any particular toxin travels faster and further relative to others, and determine its effect on the community. Any plans on determining that safe perimeter?
I think the question was for me, correct?
Anybody that can answer, I guess.
I feel a little awkward to say this, but for us, it's funding. You know, each sample requires funding and to be analyzed for people to calibrate the data and so on. So as of now, we have done it on, let's say, a voluntary base as a service to the community, but to do more of a source, deeper understanding, as you said, we need to set the perimeter, we would need to analyze a much higher number of cans in one day, repeat that multiple days, so that brings the volume up. And unfortunately, we cannot do that anymore on a voluntary base, and we need some funding from somewhere. Otherwise, we can do it.
Okay, do you have an estimate of the cost and time that the effort that will, what does it take to make sure we determine a safe perimeter for the residents?
So the effort and time, that's what we do. So we can put the effort and we can put the time. We've done a similar type of study recently in Pasadena. That was a project that was funded by NSF. So we are talking about, so if we want to give a number, is maybe $200-300 per can.
Okay.
That's what we spend between, you know, paying people and machinery and instruments. So we would need to find, so if we want to take I don't know, 1 sample per hour for 5 days, we can do the math.
So Lena, we also have a presentation later. It's going to be given by Dr. Sarah Reese on health risk assessment to help answer your question too. So you can stay tuned for that portion. If you still have questions about that, then there'll still be a public comment section after that if you have further questions on that process.
Okay, now, so all the studies so far are not conclusive. So what can the community do in the meantime to protect ourselves? Besides closing our windows, is there any particular air filters that you recommend that we should use to protect ourselves?
Hi, this is Joke Gosh. So, you know, I mean, I think you know, there are some personal air filters if that's something that people wish to, you know, wish to pursue, you know, but, you know, again, I do want to emphasize that the data that we've seen so far indicates that, you know, from an air toxics perspective, the levels of pollution that we've seen so far have been pretty typical of you know, air in our region. You know, but you know, obviously we do recognize that there have been odor issues, you know, from the facility, and we have worked to address it, and we continue those efforts, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later during this meeting. But you know, it's like, I guess in terms of, you know, minimizing, you know, how much of that odor that you're breathing, you know, certainly if you smell the odor, then, you know, go inside and close the windows.
Yeah, but I also understand there's some toxin that are not that odorless, that you can even smell it, like invisible killers. So that's why we're all concerned. And also we look at the VOC levels. There must be some correlation between the high VOC levels with proximity being proximity to the plant. So there's some correlation to the health or the toxin levels that's in the air. So is there any future studies that is going to correlate the VOC levels with the harmful the effects of those toxins? What's the plan of, you know, because we have seen high VOC levels, and what's the next step? Are you going to correlate the data with the effect on human body, or what's the next step on that?
So just from the air measurement perspective, not from the health perspective, but from the air measurement perspective, that's why we are collaborating with Dr. June Wood's group and with Dr. Mosavi to correlate or put side by side their VOC sensor measurements with the advantages of you know, seeing kind of this near real time total VOC compared to our samples that are then taken to the laboratory via the certified methods that can be compared against those health metrics, as well as provide that specific chemical information. So that's kind of one of our next steps to do that.
Okay, because so far out of the 3 studies, I think only the cities study took sample data from the source. The other one just took samples outside of the source. So,
so there's a source test that's going to be conducted on the crumb rubber operation. And by the source test, what we mean is there's going to be on site some testing of a lot of the different chemicals, many of the same ones that were tested by the city. So it includes the metals, includes these other heavier components, including the air toxics, to evaluate how much of that would be emitted into the air after all of its control devices. So we'll gather more information through that.
Okay. Okay, looking forward to the future analysis then.
Okay, great, thank you. And then next we have up Mark Gruber. Mark Gruber.
Hi, thank you. Couple questions. First question, with the plant operating, do you have the plant operating schedule as compared to when samples were collected? Is that something that is even known or logged or those records kept?
So this is with regards to records being kept of operations. I'm going to defer to a member of our compliance and enforcement team or permitting team who may be able to address that. So either Victor Yip, Terrence, or Jason Aspel.
This is Victor Yip. I'm the ADEO for compliance and enforcement. Thank you, Jason. And yes, we do have records of operations, but typically the plant operates from Monday to Saturday on a daily basis, and they run a morning shift and a PM shift. During the summers, they might run a late night shift, but we could evaluate the schedule and correlate it with the wind data.
But they are typically operating on those days, Monday through Saturday, as opposed to some intermittent type schedule.
Correct.
Okay. Second question, I heard reference to some meteorology or meteorological data. Was there actual meteorological data kept measured during any of these sampling events, either the AQMDs or the other ones?
So the South Coast AQMD has a meteorological station actually in Irvine. So that is some of the meteorological data that we'll be using for that. And that's something that we're also going to be working with Dr. Musavi with.
Is that data publicly available?
That data is not publicly available, but will be available with some of the data that we have.
Okay. And then final question, for the source test that takes place in the near future, will that data, those results be available to the public?
The emission data from the source test is public information.
It is, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Let's move to Lucy. And then after Lucy, we'll go to Dennis.
Maybe we should come back to Lucy. Sounds like she's preoccupied like many of us are.
So let's move to Dennis, and Lucy will come back to you, don't worry. So Dennis, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Dennis, go ahead.
Okay, I have a quick comment and several questions. Now, I keep hearing that so far, especially from AQMD testing result, that everything is at acceptable level. But I wanted to remind everybody that Tom Roberts system is not operational until, I think Amir mentioned, is February the 18th. So whatever data collected before is not representative for the future operations. So that they just don't make assumption and come to a conclusion so quickly. Now, I live in Orchard Hills, and by looking at the data presented by UCI team. There's a chart clearly shows high VOC levels after February the 18th. So to me, it's very obvious crumb rubber system has produced more pollutants in the air. Okay, that's my comment. Now I have a question regarding source testing. I know Amir mentioned the source testing will be performed for the crumb rubber system. I wanted to know, is that a self-reporting system by the AAA? Is that some data can be manipulated? Or is it something that AQMD can verify? And the second question is regarding the collocation of the Orchard Hills UCI sensors with the sample collection from the AQMD. Now we kept going back to, AQMD kept going back to, we're gonna try to cooperate with the UCI sensor. Now my question then is, does an AQMD have more sophisticated VOC sensor to help us clearly identify when there is issue with high VOC levels in the air? Instead of relying on the residents who pay out of their own pockets, some of us just trying to protect ourselves. The third question is the operations hours of AAA. Is that public information? Because I can see there are less steam and smoke between November, December, January, and timeframe. That's it.
Okay, so I think there was a first question about the source testing. Did either Amir or Jason Aspel want to comment on that one?
Right. So yeah, thanks, Jason, and thank you for the question. Yeah, this is Amir Dejbaksh. So we have required All American Asphalt to conduct a very extensive source test to determine the emissions from the chrome rubber system. Now, just to give you a little bit of explanation how the source test is done, the way the process works out is that the facility is required to submit a protocol to us that will demonstrate, that will show how the source test is going to be conducted. Now, typically the facilities don't do their own source test; they hire contractors or other source testing facilities to do the source test. So the source testing company prepares a protocol, and the protocol is basically shows how the source test will be conducted and what methods they're going to be using. The facility would submit that protocol to us. We will review it. And if we find a protocol that is submitted to be acceptable, then we will notify the facility or their contractors that the test can be conducted based on the protocol that was submitted. During the time of the testing, we typically require the facility to give us a 7-day notification so we can be present during the testing. The contractors that are hired by the facility will do the actual testing, and then the samples that are being collected will be sent to a third-party approved laboratory for analysis. Now, once the analysis is completed, then the source testing company prepares a report and will submit the report back to us for review and approval. At that point, our source testing engineers will go over the report. They will try to determine what was conducted. Was it in compliance with the protocol that we had approved? And if the data is representative of what it should be. So if there is anything that is completely abnormal or the testing was done incorrectly, our source test engineers will identify it and will either accept or reject the source test data. After all of this is done, then our source testing engineers, our source testing department will either approve or deny or determine that the source test was not complete or cannot be used to determine the emissions from the equipment. So this is basically, in a nutshell, what the source testing is. What do we do as part of our source testing? Now, the source testing that was imposed on this facility for the chrome rubber system is a very extensive testing. It basically tests the inlet and outlet of the carbon adsorber, so we will know exactly what is being seen by the carbon adsorber. Because if you recall from our previous meeting that we had given them the research permit to install the carbon adsorber to control the odor from the process. But as part of this testing, we're going to find out what is the actual emissions from the chrome rubber system and how effective is the carbon adsorber in controlling the emissions that is being generated as part of this process. I hope I answered your question.
And then you had a question on the co-location of UCI, and are there other sophisticated techniques? As mentioned, there are other techniques that South Coast AQMD has, but when looking at the questions that we're addressing in terms of the gaseous air toxics causing health concerns, the current technology and approach is very appropriate for that. Working on the, capturing more chemical information as part of the short term, at least as it relates to All American Asphalt. That's information that's helped support the nuisance aspect, which is in support of compliance. But since there is initially there was not other odors or other things associated with the concerns other than the asphalt smell, the source was pretty well characterized and did not need further analysis. But that's why we're now kind of exploring some other things with regards to potential other concerns. And then there's that third question with regards to the smoke and public records. And I think Victor was going to answer parts of that.
Thank you, Jason. And so, yeah, the operating schedule is not made public according to All American's website. What we know is that they do produce asphalt starting usually early in the morning, but their schedule is based mostly on demand for asphalt for nearby construction projects. And with respect to the visible emissions that you referred to being seen in, the months of November, December, January, our staff evaluates that as to be steam or water vapor, and the lower temperatures in those months shows the water vapor to have that white condensate look to it as it's coming off of the equipment.
Jason, before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to also add that the source testing has to be done during typical normal operating conditions. So it's not like that they can just source test the equipment anytime they want. It has to be representative of their normal operation.
Great, thank you for the addition, Mayor, and thank you for the question. We're going to go with Dennis now, and then after Dennis, we'll go with Larry Agrin. Dennis, go ahead.
Hey, Jason. I already spoke. I'm actually wanting to follow up on the AAA operation hours. I know that it's not public.
It's about operation hours. Can we save that for a public comment, please, and try to get to the questions with the air monitor?
Okay, that's fine.
Appreciate it. All right, Larry Agrin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you for creating this forum for the exchange of information. It's much appreciated, I think, by everybody. I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions regarding the testing here. What appears evident to me is that much more testing needs to be done, and ideally pursuant to agreed upon protocols so that data, information, can be shared between and among all of those doing the testing. I'm not nearly as sanguine about what has been the result of the testing, the scant testing so far done, as others are. The concerns I have are, first of all, there are very troubling spikes here in the measurements that can't be just kind of swept aside and, in a sense, covered up by these 24-hour tests that dramatically dilute the results, and I think have to be supplemented with much more testing. Second thing is, typicality. What is typical? There's typicality, and then there's what's typical for Irvine. Certainly when it comes to odors, those are not typical here in Irvine. And I think it's imperative that we look not only at air quality, but the quality of life that's being experienced by people under these conditions. So let me present two questions. One, is there any doubt whatsoever that the principal source of the problems being experienced in the northern part of our city are attributable to the operations of AAA? That's one question. Second question is regarding confirmation of odors. I received a report from a resident that somebody can report an odor incident. AQMD inspectors could come out, confirm it, but if the resident is not ready side by side to be contacted at the same time, that's not regarded as a confirmation. Those are my two questions. Is that the case regarding the odor confirmation? And then again, question, is there any doubt but that AAA is the source of the problems?
So I think in terms of what we're saying as the data, I mean, our data is saying that the VOC levels are not high, looking at specific gaseous air toxics that are in our samples. And, the Dr. Jumu and Dr. Musavi, they're definitely showing that, and there are certain times that there are higher VOC levels than others. But to characterize that at this point, and you heard it from him in terms of, in the context of health are difficult. And that's why we're doing other collaborative efforts to answer some of those questions. So, your question, does more work to be done? It is, and it will be done, and that's what we're working towards. And then your second question may be answered in our enforcement program that we'll have a little bit later, because we'll be having our compliance department talk about confirmation of voters, so they can address it during that section. So thank you. Let's move to Karen Jones, please.
Hi, just a couple of questions. We can just take them one at a time. We heard that the results were typical, was the term we heard, but how typical is it relative to the number of complaints that have been lodged thus far on this case? And considering the fact for every one formal complaint that is actually made, there's probably some multiple of that has not been made.
So I think as Dr. Baker and we've been mentioning that two different issues. One is an odor issue, short term. The other one is kind of the long-term concern for air toxics. So that's why there's different types of measurements. So when we're saying typical, we're framing it in the context of that longer-term air monitoring type of effort, and looking at the gaseous air toxics. And in terms of the complaints, that's the shorter term. That is the shorter term question of connecting it to the complaints. And you heard a little bit from our Deputy of Enforcement, Terrence Spann, to talk about the complaints and information that Dr. Bartletta's group had provided with their analysis of the short-term events.
How many formal complaints have there been to date on this particular matter?
That will be answered in a later section. That will be provided. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Well, I would have a follow-up question if I knew that, because that's important for me to know, so I can ask you how typical it is to follow up on how typical that number of complaints is. Because otherwise, I don't know how you reconcile the high level number of complaints with a finding of the air quality being typical.
So the two different classes of compound nuisance is related to odors, and some of the other measurements that we're talking about are related to air toxics. So there are some compounds, the ones that people are smelling that are asphalt related. There's a lot of compounds within asphalt production that are can be smelled by the human nose. So I think when you're looking at complaints, you're looking at how often are the emissions can be smelled versus total exposure is the air unhealthy from a long-term air toxics perspective. So I hope that it helps address part of the question. And then again, we'll provide some of the reports on the complaints in the enforcement update.
And how concerning is it to the AQMD to have this level of complaints, and how high up the food chain at the AQMD, like whose radar is this particular matter on?
So
how high does it go?
We have all of the executive staff. We also there's a couple of our board members who are present. So this attention is pretty high, I would say. But this is not an air monitoring related question. You're definitely welcome to provide more comments like this at the public comment period at the end. Thank you. Let's move to Daniel S. Daniel S, please. Daniel S.
What's the, is it *9 to unmute on the phone?
Paul, could you provide directions if Daniel S is on the phone? It could be *6. If you're on the phone, Daniel S, *6.
And I unmuted him manually too.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We'll wait a couple seconds, Daniel. Okay, Daniel, we'll try you again.
He looks like he's unmuted.
Hello? Daniel, we can hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I caught the presentation late, and I do appreciate what you guys have presented so far. I'm just trying to digest it a little bit and distill it to some more essential understandings for myself as a resident in Orchard Hills and my family. But as Larry and a few other recent people on the line have implied, I think we're getting some mixed messages. We're getting, on the one hand, the mission statement, the AQMD wants to find any problems and resolve them. And then we're hearing about incomplete data or data sets that are inconclusive. And I think that just is disconcerting for an individual who is worried about their health in this regard. Now, I realize there's plans for more testing, but I don't know how many residents in Orange County or in the city of Irvine, how many communities have this level of complaint and concern, such that maybe what would be satisfactory normally for the AQMD might not be enough. In other words, a lower threshold for a community that is viscerally bothered by what they're smelling, even if the odors are not related to something toxic or volatile. But in the end, I don't think this issue is going to go away with what might be considered a standard quality assessment for a community that doesn't have this level of complaint. And if for what is being said is that from what we see, we don't see any problems, is almost saying, like, if we've done the preliminary testing but it's not complete, we don't see anything bad in what we see. But in this phone call alone, I'm hearing multiple comments about the sampling size might not be enough, or the samples might not be adequate. And that to me sounds like very concerning or inadequate data. But yet the mission statement is, we are here to ensure good air quality for residents, and we don't find any conclusive information about toxins. So I guess we need to reconcile that statement so people can walk away from this not wanting to have another meeting or pushing an agenda that investigates something further when none needs to be done.
Okay, I think Dr. Joe K. Gosh will be addressing that one.
Sure. So thank you for your question, and I fully understand that there was a lot of presentations about different monitoring efforts, and they're all trying to address different questions, really, from the community. The first presentation from Dr. Musavi was really, just trying to address the question of, using kind of these low-cost sensors, where and when might there be higher or lower levels of VOCs in the community. And unfortunately, with that kind of device, you can't really draw any conclusions in terms of whether something is, concerning for your health, right? So that is why, we followed up in terms of using a very detailed, very high quality, very accurate type of measurement that helps answer that question about, well, are there any pollutants here of health concern? And again, so far, with the data that we have, it looks like the levels really aren't different from what the typical levels are. And in addition to that, they are far below any health-based thresholds that have been established in the state of California. I would also mention that, when the scientists and those agencies establish those health-based thresholds, they do a thorough review of the science, including studies on humans, studies in animals, like toxicology type studies, and they look for the most sensitive endpoints and try to establish those standards so that it protects the most sensitive people, right? Whether it's children or people who have asthma or other respiratory conditions. So those standards are set to be protective. So I definitely wanted to emphasize that these are not, arbitrary standards, but that these are things that have been looked at very carefully from a scientific perspective.
Great, thank you. Anything else, Daniel? Okay, hearing none. We are going to move to prayas@hotmail.com.
Hello?
Oh,
sorry.
Daniel, you still had another comment? You have about 20 seconds.
Just so that maybe a final summary just for myself and those that are on the line. Is it safe to say then, from a regulatory agency perspective, that there is no risk to the residents of Orchard Hills from any kind of toxic chemicals in the air, despite what we smell, and that no further testing is needed at this point? Or is there going to be a more exploratory step to determine this at a much deeper level?
So I think you heard from Dr. Gosh earlier that, even with ambient air, there is already some pollutants in the air that are of concern in terms of levels. But I think the messaging here is that we are working to address a couple of other questions, and we also have later in the program other steps that the agency is doing to evaluate the risks to the community, and that will be with Dr. Sarah Reese in the health risk assessment section of the program. Okay, now we can go to prayas@hotmail.com.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Priya Srivastav, and I'd like to thank our UCI professors for all that they've done with no pay. I understand that Irvine, are our mayor and other council members here besides Larry? Thank you, Larry. My timer's running and I'm getting no answer.
Hi, Priya. This is Anthony Quo. I'm on, and I know the mayor, Mayor Khan is on as well.
Okay, great. All right. So I was just happy to know that, you're here listening to the results today of those who you've also paid to do the job. I wanted to ask, I'm confused greatly because, and I hear it repeatedly from other residents, AQMD, your summary is that the air is typical. UCI is saying that we need more data because it's warranted from the samples that we have. I would like to hear that UCI and AQMD are going to work together. I find absolutely no purpose in spending $90,000 on a private contractor who concluded there's no problem as well. Very irresponsible spending of taxpayers' money. Thank you very much to our council for that. Could you please tell me, AQMD, if UCI is saying that, like Dean Baker said, could you use this specific measuring method, and your response is, oh, we don't consider that to be warranted. That's for more heavy stuff. I mean, he is a respected professional in the field. I would like to hear you guys saying, you know what, sure, let's try it. I don't know what would be the reason to not do what he's asking besides saying it's not warranted. Do you remember which device he was asking you to use for a more detailed response and measuring?
So, I mean, we are working with the UCI researchers, and again, combining the strengths of both of our measurements together, and that's already a solution that we're working collaboratively on. As far as some other questions about resources, it's similar to what Dr. Barletta said. I mean, South Coast AQMD and also our personnel resources, we're committed to doing other projects as well. And, as far as applicability to that scaled approach. Again, if there's something that we see in our data, we follow the data. And if there's something we see in that is, in the level of health concern, we will move on and put more resources into it. But as you heard from others, we're not seeing that in our data and are not applying that. But we are exploring some other options with the UC Irvine professors to address a slightly different question on nuisance.
So UCI said, get more cans out there, more samples over a longer time. Are you going to do that? Yes or no?
Well, we are working with them to collect more samples, and we're moving, we're looking to relocate to areas following the complaint data we have, and we're going to collaborate with them on siting for our additional sampling. So yes, we are doing more sampling.
Jason, could I speak for a second since my name was mentioned?
Yes, please.
Well, I was asking Jason.
Yes.
Yes,
go ahead,
go ahead.
Dr. Baker.
So I just want to say that I think there continues to be this confusion, and I understand it is very confusing. I'm just going to give a couple of numbers here. OHIHA establishes the risk levels based on either acute exposures, 8-hour exposures, which are excursions, or chronic exposures, which is the average, not only really over 24 hours, but 7 days a week for years. Okay. Typically, those are the lowest levels because they could result in chronic effects. But I'm just going to give you a number. For xylenes, all combined, the chronic exposure REL is 700 micrograms per cubic meter. The acute is 22,000 micrograms per cubic meter. And typically the 8 hours and the acute can be much higher. And what it means is that you can have excursions above the chronic level that on average over the lifetime are not going to cause chronic health risk. I think that's what AQMD people keep saying, that the excursions they're seeing are not only typical of that the average levels are not only typical of background in other communities, but they don't seem to be above the OHIHA well-respected risk levels. And the other issue here is, well, what are the excursions? How high are they? And why are they causing odors? And so I think the confusion is always about that, because I don't hear people saying that the odors are not a problem, but the chronic health exposures, the chronic risk from chronic exposures right now, the early data don't suggest that. I think the questions that focused on that were more about, how do you know that these 8 or 10 sampling days are typical? So that's something that needs to be addressed. How can we have confidence that a small number are typical? You're essentially saying, well, these probably are pretty typical days, but that's where the co-locating strategy comes into play. And then the other sampling methods are to have shorter term sampling. And you said you're thinking about that, you're going to collaborate with that. And I'm sure the UCI investigators will look forward to that. But again, I just want to try and reemphasize for people that when they're talking about health risk, it's really pegged to the chronic exposure criteria, which is based on day in and day out averages, not the excursions. And the excursions are really a separate question. So I'm just trying to say that to try to help, have people be thinking about these two parallel tracks. And when they're saying that the chronic exposures don't seem to be a high risk, it doesn't mean that there's not issues regarding these excursions and the acute exposures that still need to be looked at.
Jason, I think the HRA is going to address that.
Yeah, so Dr. Saravis's presentation on the health risk assessment will address part of that question. So thank you, Dr. Baker, for the additional comments. And we have 2 more for the session for comments and questions.
My time was not completed.
Go ahead.
I had about 2 minutes left.
Okay, Prayas, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Baker. I was curious as well that if I can ask the council and mayor question, or is that not possible today?
This is air monitoring section.
I wanted just to know if we can have an oversight committee involving UCI so that we can constantly be updated from AQMD what you are doing with UCI, because as you understand, with the history we've had, there's a loss of trust with the community since it has taken an enormous amount of persistence and complaint.
More relevant for the public comment section.
The question is, can we have an oversight committee so that we can have the future data? And I believe that's related to data.
Okay, if you're talking about the monitoring data, then go ahead.
Well, what is the timeline for AQMD to come back with more results? We don't know if UCI agrees or disagrees with you, and when will we see the next meeting, since this one took 14 weeks? Because Irvine City had said that the reason we didn't have a meeting until this date is because they were waiting for you guys. AQMD, or am I going to get a response?
I believe we'll have a next meeting if there is more information to share, and we have some next steps. So we'll take that in consideration.
Well, from what I understand, you agreed to work with UCI, who is recommending more testing. So I'm assuming you're going to do more testing. So when will we get the results of your next tests?
Well, our testing is already publicly available, as Dr. Katzenstein said, on our website, www.aqmd.gov.
So you're not going to be agreeing to any further testing?
There's already going to be source testing. We already mentioned that. I think
that's your crumble machine. I'm talking about UCI had, Dr. Bartletta said, we need a lot more cans out there. We need a lot more testing samples. And are you going to do further testing as UCI recommended? You said, yes, we're going to work with them and do further work. When is the meeting we're going to have again for the results of these further tests?
We are still continuing doing tests. We haven't completed. We're still continuing to sample and do the analysis, and our results are being posted online.
Excellent. Do you have a timeline of when we can keep up with your data and your results? Because we don't want this to just kind of taper out and just, you know, nothing happens from all of this. We need to have a conclusion, and we would love oversight from UCI constantly as we have trusted them. And obviously spending 200 or 300 a can is a lot better than 90,000 on a private contractor who did 4 cans.
So the data, once it's finalized, is posted to our website. So you see it every couple of weeks. We have an update.
Will it have conclusions?
So that's part of a larger, you know, there's other parts of the program for the agency. So this is just one part of that. And for South Coast AQMD, this is one part of a larger process for which we have other parts of the program to help address those questions of conclusion.
So are we considered a hotspot under your program yet?
I believe Dr. Sarah Reese will have that as part of her presentation. Okay, we will move to Tammy Kim, and then close it out with Kim Conti.
Yeah, this is Vice Mayor Tammy Kim, just letting you know that I am on the call. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And then last for this air monitoring Q&A, Kim Conti.
Hi, Jason. Thank you for putting this together. Greg, you shared that you work with asphalt plants. So aren't you concerned with seeing acetone peaks that Barbara presented? Especially since acetone is directly related to asphalt production?
Greg, I believe the question was to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, Kim. So the acetone is a much lighter compound. It would not be necessarily indicative, would not necessarily indicate that the source was the asphalt plant. Now, the acetone that the UCI staff is collecting is part of a VOC sample collection. So in our samples, the acetone did not come back high, a little bit higher, just in a relative sense, but as a compound, it's not there's no health effect associated with this level that was detected in the samples that we took. And we are familiar with asphalt operations, and acetone is not known to be one of those that is a fingerprint or an indicator of an asphalt plant operation.
So Greg, that's just, you know, an issue that we're worried about, because we've pulled up many articles and actually contacted asphalt manufacturing plants that acetone is used commonly as a solvent. So anyway, moving on, Joe K. Gosh, why do you continue to undermine UCI's technology when it was more comprehensive than yours? You know, please note that these odors are not the issue for us. It's about making sure that the air that our children is breathing is safe. Inhalation is exposure. You know, we've shared with ACQMD that since last Friday, we've seen volatile organic compounds at over 20.0. Can you please agree with us that that is not within a normal range? And it's not just one site. This is happening in 3 different sites, and it's also impacting Northwood High School. So, you know, really this is about the community just working to make sure that the air that our kids are breathing, you know, is safe.
So let me go ahead and comment on the technology part, since that's kind of in my wheelhouse. So I think each data set provides valuable information. I think we're not saying that the sensor data is not useful. I think we've been very indicative and agree with Dr. Musavi that it provides good information to show when levels are higher and lower. And that's why we're doing some of these comparative tests to the data that we're producing, which can be compared to these health-based. Again, to answer your question, Kim, is the air safe? The only way to answer that question is through the sampling analysis and the techniques and methods that South Coast AQMD is running for those gaseous air toxics. But to get an idea in terms of, hey, what does 2 or 5 or 10 ppm on the VOC sensor, what does that mean from looking at it from that kind of air toxics, is the reason why we want to collaborate, and Dr. Musavi and Dr. Jumu are doing that to collaborate, so we can have that side-by-side measurement. So if they see something on their monitor and they can compare it to their average compared to our measurements that we're seeing, tied to specific chemical species, tied to something, then it gives us an idea. And the hard part, and Dr. Musavi can either add on to this too, is that the total VOCs is just measuring kind of this bulk. I mean, in itself, it's measuring kind of like the sum or the addition of many different compounds. Each of those compounds responds differently to that sensor. So even if you were to see it in one comparison sample, depending on what the source is, that difference in chemicals or that addition may be different.
If you could, if I can add a note on that, because I feel like I need to kind of confirm a couple of the sense statement that Jason just mentioned. Could I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I feel like something that we need to first all set a ground for is that we understand that there are, given the data from all the bodies that we just presented today, all the 3 people from UCI side, South Coast AQMD, and even city consultants, I feel like we do see some variations within VOC. Some, I would call it sometimes not as expected, because in a small community like the Orchard Hills and Northwood community, you would not expect some, I would say, heterogeneous changes in terms of VOC. I understand that VOC's nature in the outdoor settings is actually, the dispersion is really fast, so you might see variations, but there are no variation peaks, and the daily data that I showed in terms of sensor data, it shows some variation. So that's something that I guess we are kind of agreeing on. That's why we are claiming that we need some more data. All of the people are kind of agreeing on that. However, setting the question or answering the question of how hazardous or how safe we are, that's actually the problem of, I'm coming from a background of air quality and health side, and I know that with the sensor data, it's really hard to make that discussion. And we haven't any time in this discussion talk that like, okay, these levels, there were some references that we used that may or may not be reliable to compare the absolute levels of VOC, but then the sensor data is not really comparable in terms of absolute value to the reference measurements. But there is this strategy that always we need to take, and this is the protocol almost, that first you see some variations with the low-cost air sensor data, and as Jason clearly and correctly mentioned, it just comes with the total VOC, and we are not really confident, and we don't have almost any information about the compounds. However, mixing these 2 data, the sensor data and the sampling from South Coast AQMD, could definitely, I would say, lead us to the answer of this question that, okay, the supplemental data that we are giving, which is in terms of spatial and temporal, is more comprehensive. However, the limitation is that we don't have any specific information about the reference data and the compounds, which is the missing part that is actually South Coast AQMD providing to the table. and giving us some information about how bad or how good the different compounds were. And also Barbara's data, Barbara's data could also has already added this value that, you know, the compounds that have been collected by canisters in different times of the day during different events, again, not enough information. We need more data on that as well.
Absolutely, Amir. And I think that's what the frustration is that, you know, our low cost technology has been collecting data that I think points to the need for more comprehensive monitoring, you know, because these peaks are happening at non-odor events when our kids are at school. And, you know, like Dean Baker was instrumental in helping us get a moratorium in place due to the health impacts of chrome rubber and synthetic turf. Yet AQMD is allowing All American Asphalt to do a 90-day test on this chrome rubber kind of equipment, which I don't think we're okay with, because we already are having issues with our air, and we just want to make sure that there are proper safeguards in place. So what is AQMD doing to ensure that All American Asphalt is not increasing the toxic emissions into the community?
I think our next three presenters are going to talk to a lot of that. Did you have any remaining air monitoring questions?
Yeah, so since we shared with you since last Friday on February 26th, we've seen new peak VOCs that again are happening at levels that we've never seen before. And as a result, Barbara pointed out, like we valued these canisters and we treasured them. So we wanted to make sure that we utilize them when we can get, you know, kind of real information as to what we're being exposed to. So just since last Friday, we've used 3 additional canisters that thankfully UCI will, you know, they now have in their possession and they will analyze, because again, that's what we need to know. We need to know that these VOCs, these, you know, particulate matter levels that are peaking like we've never seen before since last Friday is not a result of the chrome rubber that's happening. So this data is important, and you know, we're grateful that you guys are having all the stakeholders present what they've seen, but it's very frustrating to see Joe K. Gosh share that she's seeing these levels, you know, at a normal level, when, you know, I think everybody needs to work together and have a study session to kind of create the best path forward for the community.
So thank you for the comments, and you know, we are in discussions and moving forward. Again, this is just kind of you know, assessment of what's been done so far. The conversation for air monitoring is continuing and moving forward. So definitely appreciate that. And with that, that was the last question and comment for this session. So we will move on to the next.
If I could just respond, you know, I do want to say, you know, I think as you heard Dr. Musavi describe, you know, the different monitoring efforts are complementary, right? And they answer different questions. And as you heard him explain, you know, there are reasons why he's asking us to do some sampling that they don't have the capacity to do at this time, right? So you know, again, emphasizing the fact that they are complementary. You know, even before I started working at South Coast AQMD, I actually used to work with Jen Wu. I collaborated with her as a researcher, and I know her work to be high quality, so I would never disrespect her work. And we actually continue to work with her on additional research collaborations. So, you know, there's definitely no disrespect to that research team.
We'll now continue to the next part of the program. So I'm going to introduce Amir Dashbosh. He is our Deputy Executive Officer for Engineering and Permitting, and he will provide the engineering and permitting update. Amir, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jason. Well, most of the stuff that I was going to discuss was I've already explained it during the answering question and answer session, but let's just suffice it to say that we have not issued any new permits to All American Asphalt if the community recalls, during our last meeting, we said that we have issued a research permit allowing All American Asphalt to install a new carbon absorption system for control of the odors and the pollutants, and to replace the burners with the oil heaters with more cleaner burners. The equipment was not operating. It started operating last month. They started, basically they operated since on February 18, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th in February. And in March, they have been operating on March 2nd and 3rd. As I had indicated earlier, the permit that we have issued to All American Asphalt does require extensive source testing. Again, source testing at the site of generation of the emissions will determine what is actually coming out of the chrome rubber system and can help us to establish whether there's a correlation with the emissions from the chrome rubber system and what is being seen by the monitors. And if there is, and then we can proceed after the source test is completed. Now, the source testing is, we require the facility to do the source testing as part of the permit conditions within 30 days of the start of their operation. So they're supposed to finish up with their source testing by March 20th. It will take some time for the source, the samples to be collected and then submitted for analysis. And again, we have shortened the time period that it would require the facility to come back with the results to us. And then we have to go back again, as I explained earlier, to look at the results and make sure the testing was done properly, and if the data that was submitted is acceptable to us or not. And so what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to turn the presentation to Mr. Victor Yip, who's